good morning for our folks in West and Middle Tennessee, and good afternoon for our folks who are joining us from East Tennessee. We are excited to have you all here with us again for another annual Section 504 training that is going to cover the basic responsibilities and requirements under Section 504. I am Chandrea Hersey. I am the Assistant Counsel for Civil Rights and Academic Supports for the Tennessee Department of Education. Have a couple of folks who are here on the call. I'm going to ask them to do introductions as well, and then we'll move into our training session, you guys. Our training is being recorded, so you'll see that on the screen, but want to go ahead and move into introduction. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to my colleague, April Evinger, who is also presenting today.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm April Evinger. I'm the Director of Psychological and Behavioral Services for the department. Good to see all of you here today.
And Courtney, if you'll introduce yourself.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Courtney Boykin. I'm an assistant counsel on Chandrea's team, and I'm glad you guys joined us this morning.
Okay, and Nikki.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nikki Keene. I'm also an assistant counsel on Chandrea's team and happy to see everyone today.
Courtney and Nikki are going to be managing our chat for us today. They're also going to help with any technical concerns. So if you all do have any concerns on the call, please reach out to either of them. They are there to support and help answer questions as well as they come in today. So we're going to go ahead and move into our training. Just a quick note here before we get started. Generative AI tools are not being used during today's call. We are recording the training, but no AI that is going to populate any discussion is being used for our training today. And we're going to ask that you do the same and not use those types of tools or resources during our call. Next, I have a few housekeeping items here for you all. We are going to be in our session for quite a long time today, so I just want to cover these things just so everyone knows just what to expect in our training. Again, today's session is being recorded. Our session will be available to individuals who want to rewatch or who weren't able to attend today on the department's YouTube page after our training. So feel free to look there for the recorded version of this training, but just know for our call today, we are recording. We ask that you keep your microphone muted for our presentation today because of the recording. Also, this training has been approved for 4 hours of TASL credit. A link to the TASL credit approval form is going to be shared in the chat towards the end of the training. So you'll get that information about reporting your TASL credit towards the end of our training today. Also, confirm your attendance by adding your name and your email address to the chat. Use your first and last name, the name you used to register for today's training in the chat, and add your email address as well. We're going to use that to confirm your attendance, particularly when you're sending in requests for TASL credit. And then one last item here, we're going to ask that you use the chat for questions today as well. Again, this is a big session, a long session with lots of folks on our call. So we're going to ask that you use the chat feature to add any of your questions, or even if you are needing tech support as well, drop that in the chat and we will be able to recognize your questions or assist you with any technical issues from messages in the chat. So we are going to get started. We'll go ahead and move into our agenda and these first few sections of our presentation. So today's presentation, we're going to start with the basics, right? We'll cover the basic overview of Section 504 and discuss those basic elements of this federal statute. We'll then move into a discussion about the differences with IDEA in Section 504. We'll talk about the obligations that LEAs have for serving students with disabilities under Section 504. What are those requirements, those things that they must do to ensure compliance with Section 504? We'll also talk about some other considerations. This will include some of the frequently asked questions that we get from LEAs each year. Some of these things we have included additional details in the updated Section 504 manual. And then some of these things are just things that we get questions about on a regular basis, and we want to be sure to incorporate them in our training today to ensure that they're addressed and everyone has a common understanding. And then we'll talk about discipline under Section 504 as well to close us out. So let's get into this basic overview, starting with what is Section 504? And those of you all who have been attending these training sessions, either virtual or in person for the last few years, you know that we cover this slide every year, really giving you all just the baseline of what is Section 504. It is a federal civil rights law that is part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And the goal of Section 504 is to prohibit discrimination based on disability. IDEA provides special education to students with disabilities, while Section 504 prohibits discrimination and really levels the playing field for students. This visual here, this is one that we've used for several years just to help folks get an understanding of Section 504 in application. We see that in this image, we have 3 individuals on the left side of the screen. These 3 individuals are different heights, they have different needs, and they're all given the same crate to stand on to try to peek over this fence and see the baseball game on the other side. So everyone has the same one crate on that left side. But when we look at the scene on the right, we see that those crates have been divided differently. We see that each person has the amount of crates that are going to be specifically what they need in order to allow them access to view over the fence. And that's how we want to think about Section 504. It's really about access. It's about ensuring that everyone gets what they need in order to participate in a school's programs or activities. Again, remember that Section 504 is a federal civil rights law, and those civil rights protections, they extend not just to students who have Section 504 plans, but also students who have IEPs and they are receiving services under IDEA. And then even students who may not have an IEP or a Section 504 plan. Maybe a student has a health plan because of individual health needs and needs support from the school nurse. They would be individuals who are covered by the civil rights protections of Section 504, or a student who doesn't have any kind of services plan, but that student fits into the definition of being an individual with a disability, they will be covered by the protections of Section 504 as well. We'll talk more about that on an upcoming slide, but just wanting to set the stage here with our first slide of information. So who must comply with Section 504? That's our next question, our next big question to think about. Section 504 prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability by schools that receive federal financial assistance. So that's going to be all of our public K-12 schools in the state of Tennessee. That also includes the State Department of Education as well. We're also required to ensure to comply with Section 504 and ensure that our local education agencies and our schools comply with Section 504 as well. Our next big question here is who's covered by Section 504? And it's going to be any student with a disability. And a student with a disability is going to really be defined in one of these 3 ways here that we see here on the slide. A student with a disability may be a student who has a physical or mental impairment. That's going to be a student who has that physical or mental impairment. It may it may be documented through a Section 504 plan or an IEP for that student. And that student is receiving some kind of services to support with their disability during the school day. A student with a disability could also be a student who has a record of such an impairment. When we say has a record of such an impairment, here we're thinking about a student who their educational history may indicate that previously they've been classified as a student with a disability, but they may no longer have that impairment, or there may have been an instance where they were possibly misclassified before in the past as being a student with a particular disability. So that student would be a student with a record of of an impairment. They no longer have that particular record or those particular supports or their disability or the suspected disability. But there was something documented in the past indicating that they fit the criteria, they fit into the definition. And then finally, a student with a disability under Section 504 could also be a student regarded as having such an impairment. And when we say regarded as having such an impairment, we're thinking about situations where students are going to be possibly treated as though they have a disability by the school's community. And I want to give you guys some examples to ensure we understand this one. When thinking about a student being treated as having a disability, that could appear in a couple of different ways. One would be an instance in which maybe a classroom teacher is providing some additional accommodations or academic supports for a student in the classroom in a way that would be similar to services that are provided to a student with an IEP or with a 504. But that student doesn't have a plan. In that instance, the student could be a student who fits the definition of a student with a disability under Section 504 because they are being regarded as having an impairment. They're being treated as though they have an impairment. That student maybe hasn't been evaluated. There's no medical diagnosis. There's nothing indicating that that student has a disability that's documented or that services are needed. But because of those supports that are being provided by the classroom teacher, they're regarded as having a disability. And then we have the instance as well in which maybe students in the school community, they are possibly ostracizing a student, maybe bullying a student, targeting a student, or excluding a student because they have a belief or a misconception that the student has a disability. And in their interactions with them, they are treating them as such. So that is another way in which a student could fit into that definition of being a student with a disability because they're regarded as having such an impairment. So our next big question here is, who gets a 504? I'm sorry, what is a 504 plan? When we are thinking about 504 plans, we're really thinking about that plan that is going to support the student's needs. It's going to be that written document developed by a Section 504 team or review committee, whatever it's called in your school district, that states the nature of the impairment for the student, the specific accommodations that are going to be provided, and then any related supports to be provided as well. Remember, that is going to be that support plan for the student, and that is going to be a plan that's developed for a student with a disability if they fit into that definition of being a student with a physical or mental impairment and needing the specific supports as well. We'll talk about what it means in our upcoming slide on who gets a 504 plan, because all of our students who fit under that definition, they don't get a Section 504 plan. It's only going to be our students with a physical or mental impairment that limits one or more major life activity. And it's determined that that physical or mental impairment substantially limits one or more major life activity, and that decision is made on a case-by-case basis. So we see we could have a student who fits into the definition of having a physical or mental impairment, but maybe that impairment doesn't substantially limit one or more major life activity, and there's no need for services during the school day for that student. But if there's been an evaluation and through that evaluation, it is determined that that student has that physical or mental impairment, it substantially limits one or more major life activity, there's a need for services, then that student would be eligible for a plan. Remember, these determinations are made on a case-by-case basis. And also remember that most, if not all, of our students who have IEPs, they fit into this criteria, right? Because these students, they've been evaluated, and it's been determined that for those particular students, they have a physical or mental impairment, and that physical or mental impairment it substantially limits one or more major life activity. And April will talk about what the standard is for IDEA on the upcoming slide, but there's going to be that need for that student for receiving supports, whether it be accommodations or related aids and services, whatever the supports may be for that student during the school day. So that is going to take us into our first scenario. And I did mention this at the start of our call, but yes, we do have some scenario questions in our slide deck. So we are going to want to hear from you all in the chat. If you'll take a moment to read the scenario, I'll do a quick summary. It's multiple choice, you guys, so feel free to add your answer choices to the chat when I share that information on the next screen, but take a moment to read the scenario. Okay, so here we have Sam. He's a 10th grade student at Ryder High School. He's been diagnosed with diabetes since being in the 5th grade, but he manages his blood sugar levels well. One day his mom emails the 504 coordinator requesting that he get a 504 plan because she's heard that students with disabilities need 504 plans. In her request, she also shares some documentation from Sam's doctor outlining his diagnosis. The 504 coordinator convenes the team. They schedule a meeting to evaluate the student and consider all relevant data and determine whether the student needs a plan. After the evaluation, the team determines that while the student does have diabetes, he does not need any specific accommodations or related support services from the school to meet his needs. And as a result, the team does not create a plan. So my question here for you, has the school violated Section 504 by not creating a 504 plan for Sam? Okay, and I see some people adding some answers to the chat. Please add your answers A, B, C, or D here. I know some people are giving just strong answers right off, and those answers are looking good as well, but we do have some with a little bit more detail here. So please feel free to select from these options. Okay, give you guys a few more moments to add answers to the chat. I see quite a few answers still coming in. Okay, most of what I'm seeing in the chat, it looks like people are either going with answer choice B or answer choice C. So some folks are saying no, the school has not violated Section 504 because the student is only technically eligible. And then some folks are saying yes, even though he manages his blood sugar levels well, he may still need assistance from time to time. So let's take a look and see what we have as the appropriate response here. Okay. So in this particular instance, you all, B is going to be correct. This student may be technically eligible, but based on the proper evaluation conducted by the school's 504 team, the student's impairment does not create any current need for services. Therefore, he does not need a Section 504 plan. We often get questions about that technically eligible tab in TN Post. I think most of you all on the call are probably using TN Post for Section 504 case management. And this was an example just to demonstrate how that feature is used in the platform. So we have an instance where a student has been evaluated and it's been determined that, yes, the student has a disability, but the student does not need a plan because their impairment does not substantially limit one or more major life activity, then they could be marked technically eligible in the platform. Just a little bit more here with the explanation, and hopefully this will help for some of our folks who were maybe questioning that answer. Under Section 504, as I said, a student may have that qualifying disability and be technically eligible, but if there is an indication that they do not need those additional services or related aids provided by an IEP or a 504 plan, then they wouldn't necessarily be a student who's going to need the full plan. A student with diabetes who does not need a 504 plan is still a person with a disability. So they're still protected by the civil rights protections under Section 504, those anti-discrimination protections under 504. This would just be an instance of a student who receives those protections, but they do not have a Section 504 plan. Maybe for this student, a health plan may be what's needed to manage their diabetes, or it may be that the student doesn't need a plan at all. It would just really depend on the facts that are being reviewed, the data that's being reviewed in the evaluation, and that team really determining what would be necessary for that student. Okay, I'll go ahead and pass it over to April.
Perfect. Thank you, Chandrea. So a lot of the questions that we get around Section 504 really hinge on the differences between Section 504 and IDEA, that Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We know that there is a lot of overlap. Chandrea just mentioned that a lot of our students, if not all of our students who are eligible under Section 504 are also going to be served, those students who are eligible under IDEA are also going to be eligible for those protections under Section 504. So really what we want to dig into here is how you have these conversations with your districts, because a big question we always get is, April, I'm sitting in a student support team meeting and we have concerns, yes, but we don't know if we should do an IDEA evaluation or a Section 504 evaluation. So we're going to talk through the differences here of what is appropriate, what is allowed under each. And then at the end, we're really going to give you the best definition that you could have and that you could have handy at your student support teams to really talk about the differences, the main difference between IDEA and Section 504. So we know that IDEA requires that student to have a qualifying disability. Under IDEA, that is 16 areas of eligibility. Technically it's 14 under federal law. We add that gifted and that functional delay under our state definitions. And then under Section 504, we're going to say this a lot, but essentially it's a student with a disability, regardless of whether education. So as we piece this out in terms of what this looks like, please keep in mind as we're looking at our frame of all students in our school building. Okay, so this big, large blue circle here is representing all students in our school building. And once we start to inch closer towards the more narrow definition of those students who are eligible under Section 504, we have that concentric circle in the middle. So this is where our students are eligible under Section 504, okay? And then as we keep walking to that most interior circle here, this is those students who are eligible under IDEA and who are receiving those special education services. Now, as we think about this in frame of both the differences between IDEA and Section 504, I'm going to reference back to this graphic as we're going through our evaluation conversation later in this training. And the reason I want to flag it now for you is as we think about this graphic and moving students potentially out of eligibility for IDEA. So let's do an example of a student was eligible under speech language impairment. They've met all their goals. They've been reevaluated and determined no longer eligible under IDEA. As soon as we step out of that concentric circle, which circle are we in? We are in the land of Section 504. So should we be considering those students who are either made not eligible under IDEA or potentially evaluated and determined not eligible before they ever receive special education services? Should your teams consider if 504 evaluation would be appropriate for those students. And that word is the most important piece of this. It's consider. You're going to hear Chandrea and I say this probably several times today, that nothing is ever automatic in the world of Section 504 or IDEA. So we're not saying that you automatically will tell parents that they qualify for Section 504 once they are out of that land of IDEA, but it is certainly something to consider with your teams. So again, as I just referenced, and Chandrea just did a great job of giving you that high-level overview of Section 504. It's that broad civil rights law. I call Section 504 not only that anti-discrimination law, it's an access law. It's all around giving access to our students with disabilities. We know that Section 504 is not funded in the same manner that IDEA eligible disabilities are. And those qualifying disabilities are quite different. You're going to hear Chandrea talk later about what those qualifying disabilities could be. And goodness, it is not exhaustive list because every year we have new disabilities that present themselves. Goodness, 5 years ago, we didn't know such a thing as COVID, correct? So the 14 disabilities plus those 2 state disabilities are will ensure eligibility under IDEA, but really those qualifying disabilities under Section 504 could be any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. There is a definition of FAPE under both IDEA and Section 504, and this is what I typically reference when you as a 504 coordinator call me and you say, April, I am trying to get my team to understand why this proposal is appropriate or not appropriate. And I lean into the definition of FAPE under Section 504 often. Under IDEA, we know that appropriate means something very different than it does under Section 504. Under IDEA, we say appropriate is essentially that any goals or outcomes that you desire for that student should be reasonably calculated in light of that child's unique educational circumstance. So this is an example I often give. So a student with a significant cognitive disability under IDEA, we wouldn't require or propose that the child would be on grade level by the end of that IEP cycle. Not only is that not reasonably calculated, but it's probably not appropriate given that child's unique circumstances, correct? Now, under Section 504, appropriate means something very different. It just means that you are going to provide an education comparable to non-disabled peers. Not better, not worse. So when we get to the place of talking through the evaluation, eligibility decisions, and what you're proposing to include in that 504 plan in terms of related services accommodations, this is the definition I want you to lean into, because we often have some requests from our teams or maybe our parents that are asking for accommodations or supports that in light of this definition may not be appropriate for that student. So again, our obligation is to provide an education comparable to non-disabled peers, not better, not worse. You're going to hear me say that a few more times. So eligibility, again, under Section 504, they're eligible if they have that physical or mental impairment that substantially limits that one or more major life activities. And they are not required to need special education. That two-pronged approach to IDEA eligibility still is maintained under IDEA. They must meet criteria for one of those 16 areas of eligibility. And then that second prong is they must have an adverse educational impact. I also hear this quite often from districts when you call and you say, April, this child doesn't require a Section 504 plan because they're doing okay with their grades and there's no adverse impact. Keep in mind that the standard of eligibility under Section 504 is different than under IDEA. All we're asking for your evaluation and your team to decide is, do they have a mental or physical impairment? And then to the extent, does it substantially limit one or more major life activities? Folks, we're going to talk about this a little bit later in the training, but that may be above and beyond just grades and performing well in the school. We're looking at a different threshold under Section 504 than we are under IDA. So keep that in mind as you consider those requests for evaluations and eligibility from your parents and from your 504 teams. Accessibility, we are not going to dive greatly into accessibility. I know Chandrea will mention a few pieces of this later, but 504 really has detailed regulations all around accessibility, not only of our programs, but also of our facilities. IDA does not specifically mention anything really around accessibility, but keep in mind, you're going to hear us say this a couple times too throughout today. Where there's any ambiguity on either side of Section 504 and IDA, we lean into the other. So, for example, the next section talks about reevaluations. 504 only requires what we define as periodic reevaluations, right? The statute says periodic. Well, I am sure that if I went around to all of you, your definition of periodic may be different. But where there's any ambiguity, as I mentioned, we're going to lean into IDA. And IDA requires those reevaluations to be conducted at least every 3 years. So again, there is no specific mention under IDA, but we're going to lean into Section 504 to know. And because those students who are eligible under IDA are also provided those protections under Section 504, that the protections and accessibility requirements under 504 will also be applicable to those students who are eligible under IDA. Just another note about these reevaluations. As you see here, periodic reevaluations, we know we're going to lean into IDA's standard around conducting those reevaluations at least every 3 years. If you're using our TM Pulse system, it's going to tell you when those reevaluations are approaching and when they're due. This is just another benefit of utilizing that platform. Keep in mind, at the end of all of this content, we will be doing a short walkthrough of that system. But again, another benefit for you to use the TM Pulse system. 504 does have a distinction here between reevaluations under IDA and 504. You'll notice under this chart that reevaluations are required prior to a significant change of placement. That is not a requirement under IDEA. So let's talk about what that means. A change of placement could be the student is transitioning from elementary to middle to high school to graduation. A change of placement could also potentially be maybe being remanded to a district alternative school or some other disciplinary setting due to a code of conduct violation. So keep in mind that those are required prior to that significant change of placement. So you'll need to work with your 504 teams, your 504 coordinators to ensure that they are complying with those reevaluation requirements, not only triennially every 3 years, but also before a significant change of placement. Transition services. We know under IDA that when a student turns 14 in the state of Tennessee, that they are entitled to participate and start to plan what that transition is to their post-secondary goals. That is not required under Section 504. We get calls quite often that ask, April, am I required to invite a student once they turn 14 to a Section 504 meeting? Nothing requires that under Section 504 statute, but do I think it's probably best practice? Sure. We want students, once they're developmentally appropriate to be included in these meetings, we want them to learn to self-advocate. And in order to do so, we need to start inviting them and really building their knowledge and skills around their area of disability early. And so through consultation with their family, their parent and guardian, you may start to include them at the age of 14. Sometimes it may be appropriate to include them earlier than age 14. But again, keep in mind, it is not required, and you are also not required to do those transition services within a Section 504 plan. Another piece of those transition services are those summary of performances that are required when a student either ages out or graduates with a regular ed diploma and under IDEA. Those are not required under Section 504, but certainly ensuring that prior to a significant change of placement and the student is going to graduate from their local school zone, if they do anticipate going to a post-secondary setting, whatever that looks like for that student, it is in your best interest to consider, one, if a reevaluation is necessary, and then ensuring that they have all of the documentation that they need to take those instruments to their potentially disability resource office at that institution and request those accommodations. Independent educational evaluations. Many of you know under IDEA that anytime the child is evaluated and the parent disagrees, the parent may request at no cost to them an evaluation by an outside psychologist, speech language pathologist, okay? That is not required under Section 504. So if a parent disagrees with your evaluation, really they're going to work through their due process rights, which Chandrea is going to discuss later in this presentation. They are not entitled to an IE, an independent educational evaluation. Parental involvement in decision-making. Parents are absolutely required members under IDEA. We know that parents offer very unique perspectives on their child's experience in school as well as what's happening at home. And we strongly encourage you to ensure that you are bringing parents on board until students reach that age of majority. Now, you'll note here, and sometimes it's a little shocking for folks if they've never attended Chandrea and my training before, that parents are not necessarily required members throughout the Section 504 process, but they are certainly encouraged. We want parents to have a seat at the table if it's appropriate. But if you come to a place where parents are not being collaborative partners, we're going to talk at later slides about when they are required, especially for that written consent. And then if they come to a place where they're not showing up, you're trying to engage them and you're giving multiple reasonable attempts to engage the parent, there are opportunities for your team to move forward, continue to serve the child, even if the parent is not able to participate. So as I alluded to before, this is a critical piece of knowing when we're going to go left or right in terms of our evaluation. I will say we have some districts that have policies and procedures in place that indicate that teams will always start with an IDEA evaluation or always start with a 504 evaluation. There are some inherent risks to those policies and procedures, as I've just stated, in terms of procedural rights that are afforded to parents under IDEA versus 504. But I think having this definition is going to be in your best interest when you are considering what type of evaluation to start with. Here is how IDEA defines what specially designed instruction is. And specially designed instruction is special education. And this is what students are able to receive if they have an IEP. So students under a Section 504 plan are not receiving specially designed instruction through that 504. They're receiving related services and accommodations modifications as appropriate. So specially designed instruction as defined by IDEA is adapting as appropriate the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction to address that child's needs. And so as we're sitting at those tables, conducting those support team meetings, these are good questions to ask your general education teachers, and then also perhaps ask your parents. Are we having to adapt the content? Are we having to change the standard for which we're holding students to in our classrooms? Are we having to pull the student back to our kidney table and do a completely different intervention program with this child in order to ensure that they're meeting grade level standards? Are we having to slow down the delivery significantly? And we're not just talking about normal reteaching and remediation. We're talking about really having to go above and beyond for these students to ensure that they're able to access and make progress. So when we're asking teachers, are you having to give extended time? Are you having to do some preferential seating? Are you having to re-ask questions in different manners and in different modalities? All of that sounds very much like accommodating those students and their applicable disabilities. But if we start to hear that we're having to change or adapt, again, content, methodology, or delivery of instruction, it probably would be in your best interest to first start with an IDA evaluation. The reason why it's often somewhat problematic if we start with a 504 evaluation instead of potentially an IDA evaluation is just due to delay of services in those timelines, right? So we want to be very cautious that we're not unnecessarily delaying services to the students, because we do have essentially 60 days to conduct that initial evaluation. Keep in mind that Section 504 does not dictate a timeline for when those initial evaluations need to be completed. But as I just referenced, if there's any ambiguity on the side of one or the other, we lean into IDA. So 504 doesn't specify timelines, so we lean into IDA, which does dictate that those evaluations are completed within 60 days. T-Impulse will track those timelines for you if you are utilizing that for your 504 management. So when we initially evaluate and we have 60 days, then we have additional time to create our 504 plan if necessary. But if we take 60 days, determine, oh, this is actually not a 504 concern at all, and now we need to pivot, get consent under IDA, and then now we have additional 60 days to evaluate under IDA, and then we have an additional 30 days to develop that IEP. Procedurally, that could be problematic for your district. This is why it's critical during those support team meetings to have the right players at the table, to ask the right questions on the front end, to really understand that child's true strengths and weaknesses. One, to be able to better complete that assessment plan, to know what areas we need to evaluate and for what reasons, but also to know, should we start with a 504 evaluation or should we start with an IDA evaluation? Again, there could be some inherent procedural risks if we misstep on the front end. So we want to ensure, again, that your support team processes are robust and that they are consistently enforced across your district, and that we are asking, again, the right questions on the front end in order to identify which pathway is most appropriate. Okay. I'm going to stop control and give that back over to you, Chandrea. I do see a question in the chat about, is that 60 calendar days or school days? T-Impulse tracks calendar days, not school days. So it's 60 calendar days. Keep in mind, under Section 504, I know Chandrea will probably mention this at some point. We get a lot of questions about Chandrea and her team's supervision of, the platform or the compliance pieces. The state does not monitor compliance under Section 504, but Chandrea will definitely tell you their role in terms of due process and grievances. So keep in mind, I will say this. We always want to talk about in terms of reasonableness in completing evaluations under Section 504. So I don't think you're going to have any huge concerns if you complete that evaluation in maybe 61 days, right? But the further we get away from 60 days, the more likely procedurally that you have misstepped. But again, if you're using T-Impulse for that 504 management, it's going to give you a big scary red stop sign if you have exceeded that 60 days, and it will not go away until you have finalized either the eligibility or non-eligibility for that student. So we would strongly encourage you to adhere to those 60 calendar days for those evaluations.
And I'll just add to that as well, April. So I know you mentioned the T-Impulse platform, and while our team does not actively review T-Impulse for Section 504 case management, we definitely have different grievance options that are available to parents. And we are also in constant collaboration with districts as well. Several of you all on this call have probably had interactions with our team about different parent communication that we may have received about specific issues or even claims related to systemic concerns in school districts as well. Okay, so we will go ahead and move into our next section here, which is covering district obligations. And we'll talk more about these grievance processes in this portion of the presentation. But let's take a quick look at all of the different obligations that school districts have under Section 504. We've compiled somewhat of a list here for you guys, and this doesn't cover everything, but it covers so many of those that are key to providing services for students and are key to ensuring that students have equal access to programs and activities as well. So the first requirement here is that all of our school districts, all of our local education agencies implement a Section 504 policy. This policy should include your anti-discrimination statement. It should also clarify what your grievance procedures are, what the procedural safeguards are for parents as well. That takes us into our next bullet point, providing those procedural safeguards and grievance processes. Not only are you required to make mention of them in your policies or in information that's shared with your school community, those practices should also be in place to ensure that parents are able to exercise their rights, parents and students rather, are able to exercise their rights under Section 504 and challenge decisions that are maybe being made by the Section 504 team, or to ensure that the district is providing them with sufficient notice of information and complying with the requirements of Section 504 as well. Under Section 504, school districts are required to respond to complaints of discrimination, bullying, and harassment towards students with disabilities. All of our districts should have anti-bullying and discrimination policies that speak about how they are to respond to those sorts of claims. That is required under our state statute, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on an upcoming slide. Also, accessibility, athletics, extracurricular activities. Our students with disabilities, they should be allowed to participate in athletics and extracurricular activities and have access to any programs that a school district may offer. Child fine is also a requirement under Section 504. Districts are required to find and evaluate find and notify any students or parents of students with disabilities and conduct those evaluations as necessary. Referring those students suspected of being students with disabilities that substantially limit one or more major life activity, referring those students for the evaluation process and conducting those evaluations, ensuring that you have done a thorough assessment of the data that's been provided and collecting important data points to ensure that you have enough information to make those decisions. And then providing FAPE when it has been indicated that a student is going to need services under Section 504, and ensuring that they are receiving the free appropriate public education that they're entitled to, and ensuring that FAPE is being provided in the least restrictive environment as well, ensuring that students have access to their same age non-disabled peers. So let's talk about these different requirements in a bit more detail. As I mentioned, districts are required to implement a policy that is going to cover non-discrimination clauses and that provision itself. And also, it speaks about your grievance processes under Section 504. Most of our school districts in the state of Tennessee are using either the TSBA model policies or some version of those policies as well. So for most folks on the call, you can find your Section 504 policy in your policy manual at Section 1.802, and it's combined with your ADA grievance procedures as well. Again, these policies, they must be made available to students and families. And for most of our districts, that means that it's posted on your website, in your policy manual. Some may even include it in their handbooks as well. And some may still have that binder, right, on your campuses that includes that information. With the procedural safeguards that are required under Section 504, LEAs must have a system in place to ensure that these procedural safeguards regarding identification, evaluation, and educational placement are made available to parents and students. The procedural safeguards must include notice of the district's requirements under Section 504. They must include a process of how parents could conduct a review of records for their student. They must include details about due process hearings available for parents, and those due process hearings, we'll talk about them in the next slide as well. And then they must also include a procedure for review as well. If any concerns that are being reviewed through the process or other complaint mechanisms are needing to be reviewed at a higher level. With procedural safeguards, if you are using the TN Post platform for case management for Section 504, there is a procedural safeguards document there. That document is available for any of our LEAs to use. Please feel free, if necessary, to modify that document so that it fits your district's needs, but that district covers all of the basic requirements of what should be outlined in the procedural safeguards notice. And it gives the basic information that parents need to know about a school district's obligations under Section 504 and how to exercise their rights if they are having concerns regarding the implementation of a student's plan, or specifically the identification, evaluation, and educational placement of a student, or just general concerns under Section 504 as well. Thinking a bit more about due process procedures and these grievance options, LEAs must establish due process procedures that are going to allow parents to challenge these decisions made by the Section 504 team, but those are specifically related to, as I mentioned, identification, evaluation, and educational placement for students as it relates to Section 504. With the due process procedures, LEA's processes should outline the structure of any due process hearings that the district will host and the timelines associated with these hearings as well, and the procedures for selecting a hearing officer. These due process procedures and these due process hearings are conducted at the school district level. I know for IDEA, those complaints, they come directly to the state. They go to our special education dispute resolution team. They process those, and we work with the Attorney General's office to assign an ALJ, an administrative law judge in those particular cases. But for Section 504, the process works a bit differently. The district is managing due process hearings, and they're required to have procedures in place that are going to allow them to manage that process. Remember, for any of the challenges that are moving through due process, they are going to be on those three bases. So just for identification, evaluation, and educational placement. And in most cases, it's going to be the parent who is using the due process procedures to challenge decisions made by a Section 504 team. But there could be an instance in which the LEA may need to pursue due process as well. A lot of times we get questions about what should an LEA do if they suspect a student or believe that the student needs special education and related services. They suspect this is a student with a disability under Section 504, and that disability is substantially limiting one or more major life activity for this student. But the parent has not consented to the evaluation. How should the LEA approach that? How should they handle that if they are unable to obtain consent from the parent to conduct the evaluation? Due process may be an option for LEAs in this instance. They may be able to initiate a due process hearing to seek to override the parent's denial of consent there. So that is another instance in which due process may be used. But in most cases, what we're going to see is that due process is going to be exercised by our parents who may take issue or have some concerns about the Section 504 team's identification, evaluation, or educational placement of their child. Speaking about other grievance options under Section 504, LEAs are also required to establish grievance procedures for resolving more general complaints under Section 504. Complaints related to whether or not a student has had access to participate in different activities. We also mentioned bullying and harassment complaints as well. Those complaints will be resolved under your general grievance process under Section 504. Now, districts usually have discretion to determine how they want to frame these processes. In some districts, your Section 504 coordinator may be responsible with investigating those complaints regarding concerns related to access or general concerns related to implementation of a student Section 504 plan. Sometimes that Section 504 coordinator may also be tasked with resolving complaints related to bullying or harassment of a student with a disability. But districts can also have a structure where the 504 coordinator is tasked with the role of addressing complaints related to accessibility under Section 504, and any complaints related to bullying or harassment are going to be resolved by your school's principal, who may not be your Section 504 coordinator. Please look to your district's policy for guidance and contact your district's Section 504 coordinator at the district level as well for more clarity on this process in your district if you have questions. But again, districts have a little bit of discretion to decide how they want this to look in implementation. The grievance procedures should include reasonable timeframes for resolution. So there should be a reasonable time frame attached to how long it will take to conduct an investigation. They should also allow an opportunity to present evidence. So there should be an opportunity for the parent or the student who is filing the grievance to present evidence based on their complaint. There should also be an element where there is notification of findings. Many times when our team gets calls about concerns related to Section 504 or other civil rights areas as well, parents are often concerned that they've reported something to maybe a Section 504 coordinator or a principal or someone else in their district, and they haven't received that follow-up about how the matter is being resolved, how it's being addressed. So be sure that your internal procedures about your grievance process also have that notification of findings as well. And it must include an appeals process as well. So an opportunity for these matters to be appealed to a higher authority as well. Grievance procedures must ensure that complaints are resolved in a prompt and equitable manner. I mentioned the reasonable timelines. Again, they must be prompt. So these things must be resolved as quickly as possible with no delays unless there is a documented basis for an extension. And these investigations must be equitable as well. So we don't want instances where there is maybe someone giving deference to one side over the other who is serving in that investigation role for these grievance complaints. They want to ensure that these issues are going to be resolved in an equitable manner, really considering the information and evidence presented by both sides and all of the concerns that have been presented in the grievance complaints. I mentioned discrimination a couple of times. I do want to define that term so that we can talk a little bit further about what that means, specifically as it relates to discrimination and what could be addressed under your school district's anti-discrimination and bullying policies as well. So under Section 504, discrimination is going to be defined in multiple ways. Here are just the first three that I have here on the slide. So first, it would be denying a student based on disability the opportunity to participate in or benefit from an aid, benefit or service, affording a qualified person with a disability a benefit from, affording a qualified person with a disability an opportunity to participate in or benefit from an aid, benefit, or service that is not equal to that afforded to others, failing to provide aid, benefits, or services to that qualified individual with a disability in a manner that is as effective as those provided to non-disabled persons. And then looking at our next view on this slide, our next three here, it could also be providing different or separate aids or benefits or services to disabled persons based on their disability, aids or perpetuates in discrimination against a disabled person by providing significant assistance to an agency or organization that discriminates against individuals based on disability, denying a person with a disability the opportunity to participate as a member of a planning or advisory board. And then it could also be any other instance that otherwise limits the enjoyment of any right, privilege, or advantage or opportunity enjoyed by others who are non-disabled, or in determining the site of a facility as well, the site or location of a facility, determining that in a way that wouldn't make that facility accessible to individuals with disabilities. So we see that there are many ways in which there could be instances of discriminatory conduct that could happen towards individuals with disabilities. What I want you all to take away from this is that any treatment that may be different than non-disabled peers, any attempts to provide services that are less or that are not the same as those services that you provide to non-disabled individuals accessing your programs or non-disabled students accessing your programs, any intentional discriminatory conduct, intentions to exclude or to omit someone or prevent someone from accessing a program or activity because of their disability status. And then also with our facilities as well, attempts to not ensure that they are accessible to individuals with disabilities would also be discriminatory conduct. We'll talk more through some examples in our upcoming slides, but just wanted to give that definition as we move more into our content. One thing that we want to call to your attention today is some recent litigation. And under Section 504, there aren't too many cases that have been recent under Section 504 that have really made it through the federal courts and up to the highest level with the Supreme Court, but there's one that we're watching here that we just want to be sure that folks are familiar with and really have just some knowledge of. This particular case, it was decided on June 12th, 2025. And in this matter, the parents were seeking damages under Section 504 in the ADA. And here the parents were wanting some clarity on what should be the standard. Is it going to be that school districts must prove that a school district that parents must prove that a school district acted with deliberate indifference? Or must there be a showing that the school district just participated in the discriminatory conduct? Here we see that the court is going to indicate that parents seeking damages under Section 504 of the ADA, they must prove that the district acted with deliberate indifference. So that's our standard under Section 504. The parents must prove that the LEA disregarded a strong likelihood that the challenge action would result in a violation of the federally protected rights. So there must be some indication here that the school district had notice of the discriminatory conduct and then fail to respond in a reasonable manner. That's what that deliberately indifferent standard means. So as we think about this case, it's important to note that this standard, it is not going to be our heightened standard of bad faith or gross misjudgment, indicating that the school district had to intentionally involve or be involved in some kind of discriminatory conduct against the student. But this is also not the lower standard either of just the school district having notice and failing to act. This deliberate indifferent standard is the school district must have had notice here and then fail to act appropriately in this instance. So remember that this is when we are thinking about those legal challenges that could lead to damages against a school district. And this is going to be when we see that a parent is going to be able to prevail in receiving some kind of collection of damages against a school district related to discriminatory conduct. So looking at bullying and harassment, and as I mentioned, we define what discriminatory conduct looks like, and sometimes those types of complaints related to discrimination based on disability are going to be addressed by your Section 504 coordinator through your grievance processes. And sometimes when there are more specific claims of bullying or harassment or just discriminatory conduct in general, it may be addressed by your school's principals. Look to your policies to know what is going to be appropriate in your district. And some important things to note here, as it relates to Section 504, remember that any type of harassment based on disability is going to be prohibited under Section 504. Harassment based on disability, it essentially is discriminatory conduct, and particularly if a school district allows it to go unresolved. Harassment could look like things such as abusive jokes, crude name calling, threats, physical assault. And this applies to any form of harassment that could be related to a visible disability or even a non-visible disability as well. When a child who receives special education or related services is harassed on any basis, and this goes for our students with Section 504 plans, our students with IEPs, or our students who are going to meet that Section 504 definition, but don't have either of those plans. Maybe they have a health services plan. Maybe they don't have a plan at all. But any student with a disability, if they are harassed on any basis, whether it be weight, appearance, socioeconomic status, a school's failure to remedy that conduct could constitute a denial of FAPE, particularly when we're talking about those students who have a Section 504 plan and an IEP. But if we're talking about those students suspected of having a disability as well, not remedying the effects of that harassment could constitute a denial of FAPE. So you want to be sure that you address those concerns as quickly as possible. And as we're thinking about these grievance options, we've talked about those things that are expected of you on the school district level, and we touched a little bit too on what could happen at the federal level if a parent were to pursue this in some type of litigation. But it's important to note that as we're speaking about discrimination, as we're speaking about bullying and harassment under Section 504, that these types of complaints could also be pursued by a parent with the U.S. Department of Education as well. There is no state level grievance option as it relates to filing a civil rights complaint with the Tennessee Department of Education. We refer all of those to the U.S. Department of Education. So it is in any school district's best interest to ensure that if you get these complaints, to resolve them quickly, resolve them in a manner that complies with the requirements of Section 504, to ensure that if these are challenged with the U.S. Department of Education, you have the appropriate documentation indicating that you've done your due diligence. Remember, they're looking to see, did you act with deliberate indifference? And also, did you fail to remedy this conduct? Retaliation is also prohibited conduct under Section 504. Section 504 incorporates the anti-retaliation provisions of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And as it relates to what that means for prohibiting retaliation, no individual can be retaliated against for either filing a complaint, participating in any aspect of the Section 504 grievance process, whether that be filing a complaint for a general grievance or filing for due process or filing with the U.S. Department of Education. And it's important to remember that Section 504 also provides these protections against just compliance with the law as well. So no person can be retaliated against either for attempting to comply with Section 504, with providing access to a student with a disability to a program or service, or ensuring that there are accessibility features for facilities in a school district either. Section 504, as I mentioned, it picks up those anti-retaliation provisions from Title VI. And again, those cover any of the process related to filing complaints or participating in grievance processes. April mentioned accessibility as it related to ensuring access to programs and ensuring access to facilities earlier and looking at the comparison with IDEA. And we want to talk about that a little bit more so that everyone on the call has a common understanding of what that looks like and what that means. I've mentioned this a couple of times, but LEAs must provide equal opportunities of qualified persons with disabilities to participate in and benefit from education aid, benefits, and services. Essentially, what we're saying here is that students must have equal access and equal opportunities to participate in the programs and services offered in a school district. What is important to note about this slide as well is that when we are thinking about programs and activities, we need to think broadly and not just think about, are we ensuring that students have access to have this class added to their schedule so that they can take this course this year in high school, or that they are able to attend the honors program or the school day celebration. We also want to think about all of the things that our school district offers, whether it is announcements that are being shared with parents via email or other forms of communication. We also want to think about our websites and how that information is communicated as well. Earlier this year, the department, we sent out a notification to directors of schools informing them of a change to the ADA rules that went into effect in April of 2020, or April 2025, I believe was the effective date on those changes. And those changes were specific to website updates. And I know we're speaking about the ADA when it comes to that compliance there, but many of those requirements under ADA are similar or similarly matched under Section 504, or Section 504 allows grievance options for noncompliance under the ADA as well, as it relates to ensuring accessibility for individuals with disabilities. So as I said, we want to really think broadly when we think about equal access and think about all of our programs, all of our activities, any element of our LEA in which we are interacting with students and parents, and ensuring that all individuals have that equal access and are able to get the information that they need and are able to actively participate in the things that we offer as well. a little bit more about accessibility as it relates to facilities. So LEAs are required to ensure that students and others with disabilities, including parents, are not denied equal access to programs and activities because of inaccessible facilities. So when we think about facilities, our requirements under Section 504, they are broader than just students here. And most of this is also going to be covered by the ADA. And I know we were just speaking about the ADA on our last slide. But what I want you all to take away here is when it comes to our facilities, we want to think about not just our students having access to our buildings and our walkways and our restrooms, our athletic facilities, our parking lots, but parents as well and any visitors in our buildings. Section 504 is going to cover any individual who is interacting with your facilities when it comes to ensuring that these spaces are accessible to people with disabilities or individuals with disabilities. The requirement to ensure accessibility depends on the date of the building. There's some specific information in the regulations about buildings built or constructed prior to June 4th, 1977. So if you are wanting to really get some understanding of that, if you want to nerd out on building accessibility, let us know. We can share that particular provision of the regulations with you. It's here on the screen, but we can share some more specific details about it as well. But those particular sections of the federal regulations really go into detail about what's required for facilities based on the particular date in which they were constructed. And then any LEA facility for persons with disabilities, it must be comparable to other facilities as well. So if there's a specific restroom that is intended for use of individuals with disabilities, it must be comparable to what is offered to their non-disabled peers. And that goes for all of our facilities. So for all of our facilities and all of our activities. I do see some questions coming in the chat. We'll get to those when we pause and transition. So that's coming up in our next couple of slides here. So a couple of other things before we address our questions. As we're talking about equal access, also think about extracurricular activities and other non-academic activities or programs that your school may offer as well. Students with disabilities must be provided equal opportunities to participate in extracurricular activities and any non-academic activities that the school district may offer. This also extends to transportation, right? Our students with disabilities must have equal access to transportation. If you're offering transportation to maybe students to a ball game, and that is transportation that is offered to non-disabled students, then you want to provide equal access to your students with disabilities as well. And think about what could transportation look like in those instances, right? Also, for lunch, as it relates to the meals that may be offered, there may be a need for some meal accommodations or modifications. And we won't get into those details today, but there could be a need for that, or I'm saying we won't get into those, but I think we have a slide on that. So we may touch on it a little bit, but there may be a need for some kind of modification there as it relates to school meals, but also think about where students are seated in our cafeterias or our eating areas and ensuring that students with disabilities have access to all of those spaces. Recess. Students with disabilities must have equal access to participate in recess. Same for physical education. The same with clubs and athletics as well. They must have equal access to participate. We understand that with some of our clubs or athletics, there may be some standards and requirements, right? But if there are ways to offer some accommodations and supports for students to participate, our school district should consider those as well and ensure that students with disabilities can actively participate and have an opportunity to be a part of those things on our campuses as well. As I mentioned, if you do have some particular standards for participation, or even if you are thinking through a plan of how to ensure that students are able to receive transportation in those, different times where you may offer transportation to non-disabled peers that are outside of our usual bus route for our students, where they may be receiving special education transportation, right? Or you're trying to ensure that there are accommodations that are there for a student when they are participating in recess or they're participating in some of those non-structured elements of the day. That can maybe be addressed in the student's 504 plan. So as you are meeting and consulting with your teams and developing plans for students, be sure to really think through every element of the day when we're thinking about how the student's disability substantially limits one or more major life activity. Remember, we're not just focusing on academics, and I know April mentioned this earlier. We're really thinking about every element of our school day, thinking about from when our student arrives on our campus until they are headed home at the end of the day, even if they're participating in something after school as well. There may be a need to address that in the Section 504 plan to ensure that there are appropriate accommodations or supports there for our students who are participating in additional elements of our school beyond academics. And then one more slide here before we pause for some questions. The child find requirements under Section 504. I mentioned this at the start, but every LEA is required to find and notify the parents of students with disabilities. This is an annual obligation. And when we are thinking about this requirement to notify parents and guardians of students with disabilities, LEAs want to think broadly about ensuring that they are reaching all parents in the geographical region in which their district serves, ensuring that they are providing notifications through information on their websites, but also thinking about other ways to reach parents as well. There may be a need to share information in local newspapers, to share information on a local news station, to share flyers around the community as well. All children in your school district, or all children who live in the geographical area that your school district serves, are entitled to know about the school district's obligations to provide services to students with disabilities. So that goes for not just your students who are enrolled in your district, but all who are living within that geographical area. So school districts really need to think broadly about how to share that notification. It could be also collaborating with some of your local non-public schools as well. But that is a mandate under Section 504 that districts are required to meet annually. I'll go ahead and pause there for questions. And let's see what we have in the chat. Okay, and someone asked about the communication regarding communication from the ADA and the website updates, if that could be provided. Yes, we can reshare that information when we share information after our training today. Okay, and it looks like Courtney has shared that in the chat as well. Okay. And then I see a question, if a student has a 504 with a disability that impacts reading, does that meet the requirements for exemption under the third grade retention law? Good question, Catherine. If you can reach out to me individually with that question, I know folks have lots of questions about whether or not students whose Section 504 plans indicate that the student has a disability that impacts reading, if that student then meets the qualifications for the exemptions or the exceptions under the third grade promotion and retention law. Those are very fact-specific questions. So it really depends on how the student's disability is going to be framed in the student section 504 plan, and the district is really going to have that discretion to make the decision based on the information that they have at their hands as well. But Catherine, if you have some specific questions related to that, you can reach out to me via email and I can share some more details with you. But overall, just so folks on the call know, it really depends on what is indicated in the student section 504 plan, whether or not they meet that exception. But there is that exception and carve out under the state statute that speaks about students with disabilities that impact reading as well. And it could be that the student's disability is covered by a section 504 plan, could be covered by an IEP. Okay. And then I see another question, and I think this may be one April mentioned to me earlier today. So can a parent request a copy of the documentation showing proof that all substitute teachers receive a copy of the 504 accommodations? Great question, Melinda. And we're going to move into evaluations and plan development in this next portion of our presentation. So I'll go ahead and address this now. And if you have additional questions after we cover that section, please feel free to add more questions to the chat. I think, Melinda, if I'm understanding the question correctly here, a parent is wanting all substitutes to have access to a copy of the student section 504 accommodations, and the parent has possibly given consent, granted consent through that written consent, but they're wanting some kind of confirmation as well regarding that. In this particular instance, I would say that the parent can give the written consent stating that they want substitutes to have access to the students' 504 accommodations. And your district should really work to determine what that release form is going to look like. You really want to think about federal student privacy laws, such as FERPA, in this instance, when developing that consent form or release for the parent to grant their consent, allowing the substitutes access to the students or information about the students' section 504 accommodations. And that could serve as sufficient notice that they have access to that information, but I encourage you to work with your board attorney as well on just navigating that situation and thinking about how you're going to actually implement that in practice. What does that look like with providing substitutes access? I know you have all in bold and capital print there as well. So just thinking about what that could look like if substitutes are needing that information, and how you're going to implement that, when you're going to share that information with different substitutes who are interacting with that particular student. And April, did I miss anything with that one? I know we kind of discussed that.
No, I think you also alluded to before is ensuring that, substitutes, because if they're in the classroom, they may have educational interest to review those accommodations, but they probably don't need to see the entire eligibility document. They may just need to do the 504 accommodations at a glance document.
Yes.
And so if you already have district policies and procedures where you provide the substitute a folder and it has, the student's, IEP at a glance, 504s at a glance, that's fine. And Chandra, feel free to chime in here. I don't know if there's any requirement under 504 that you are required to provide documentation that the substitutes received it, but I certainly think it's in your best interest, going back to your policies, procedures, that they are signing out and signing that folder back in. Because if we give them the copies of that 504 accommodations at a glance or those IEPs at a glance, I'm going to be honest with you, I want those back. I don't want the substitute to leave my building that day and have those copies in a folder. So it may be a good idea to have some level of documentation that they checked it out and then they turned it right back in before they left that afternoon. Chandra, pull me back if I'm out of line here.
No, and I definitely agree, April, with what you're saying there. I know we kind of discussed this earlier about just what does that look like in implementation? What is going to be your plan for, even sharing that information with substitutes? And is there an instance where it just needs to be included in that sub binder, that sub folder? Is it something that they are, as April said, signing out in the front office at the start of the day and returning, signing it back in? Is it something that you're maintaining in your front office as well and sharing that information with them? And maybe they're not taking it with them as they head to the classroom as well. That may be an option as well. So really think about what that looks like in implementation, and the all substitutes, Melinda, from your question, just that being bold print and capitalized there, considering, is there a need for all subs to have that information prior to interaction with the student? Or are you taking the position that the substitutes are going to have that information and have access to that information when they have that specific need for interacting with that student, when there's that educational need there, and really thinking about those exceptions under FERPA and when those are going to present themselves, so that you are understanding when consent may be needed to share that information with substitutes or when it may not be needed to share that information with substitutes as well.
So let's keep going with where Chandrea left off. So we've talked a lot about the provisions and the obligations under Section 504 around discrimination, bullying, harassment, retaliation. Now let's get into the meat of, first, how do we identify students under Section 504 through that evaluation process? And what does that look like, right? And then how do we make decisions about what accommodations, what services to include? So as we both alluded to before, we know that parental consent is required in 2 instances. So the first is prior to conducting that initial evaluation for a student under Section 504, you must have written informed parental consent. The second piece of this is prior to implementing that initial provision of services, and all that means is the first Section 504 plan. You must have parental consent on that first 504 plan to implement that plan. If you do not have consent under either of these pieces, you can certainly reach out to your local board attorney and discuss options, but you are not breaching any type of procedural requirements if you determine that you're not going to essentially file due process against the parent, and you're just going to document that the parent refused or you weren't able to engage the parent in these pieces to obtain consent. Again, if you are using T&Pulse for your 504 management, all of that's going to happen within the system. You're going to obtain consent. The parent is also going to be able to sign that initial plan in the T&Pulse platform. You'll be able to monitor timelines and every other procedural requirement within the T&Pulse system. I get asked this a lot. April, what do I have to do in terms of the evaluation? What should be included and what not? So I'm not going to ask you to throw it into the chat, but I want you to just ponder this question for a minute. So if a parent brings you an outside medical diagnosis, we know that that may trigger our child find obligation to consider if an evaluation is appropriate. But our evaluations for which that we are obtaining consent must be comprehensive enough that we can respond back with data to these 3 questions listed on your screen. First, does the student have a disability under Section 504? Well, if you get an outside diagnosis, can we say that they probably have a mental or physical impairment that will be protected under Section 504? Sure. But does that outside medical diagnosis give you what are the student's individual educational needs in order to plan the 504 plan? And then how does the disability substantially limit one or more major life activities? And usually it doesn't. And that's where it's critical to bridge the gap in terms of what your assessment plan looks like and what you're evaluating for. Procedurally, we see a lot of missteps where districts just automatically take the parent's diagnosis, give the child a 504 plan, let the parent choose all the accommodations. Don't you see how procedurally that's an issue? One is nothing is ever automatic. Just because there's a diagnosis does not mean that the child automatically qualifies under Section 504 and does not automatically mean that the child requires a plan. So our evaluation must be, again, comprehensive enough to say, yes, they have a disability, what are their needs, and what related services or accommodations will we propose in that plan? And then how does that disability substantially limit one or more major life activities? So as you're thinking through what this could look like, these are going to be very much individualized to each student, correct? A student who's referred for an evaluation because of diabetes, that assessment plan is going to look very different than if a child has been referred for a specific learning disability or dyslexia, or a child who's been referred for ADHD. We have to individualize the assessment plan in the same manner that we would individualize all decisions that we're making for our students under Section 504. So what should these evaluations look like? First, we must consider and include a variety of sources of information. We should not just rely on one single sole measure, meaning that would be the outside medical diagnosis, right? That would be the sole criterion for which we're basing justification of eligibility, and that would be in direct conflict with what federal law requires. So maybe we're going to collect some additional observations. Maybe we're going to look at the student's level of engagement and time on task. Maybe we're going to complete some additional rating scales with the student. Maybe we're going to ask the parent to provide some additional background information or some developmental milestone information. Maybe we're going to get our teachers to fill out some questionnaires and some surveys to understand how the student's performing across content areas. Your team can determine what assessments are necessary to collect in order to inform the decisions of are they eligible and do they have a disability, and then does that disability substantially limit one or more major life activities. We must ensure that those assessments are specifically tailored for the questions we're trying to ask, and nothing limits necessarily what you can administer. I've seen 504 teams that have administered cognitive assessments for students because after a car accident, they had a mild concussion that the doctors noted was going to be considerably impacting for this student. And even though it was somewhat temporary, not under the definition of transitory impairment, but certainly the team needed to understand how that child's short-term and long-term memory was impacted in order to justify including some accommodations within the plan. So assessments can certainly be tailored. If you are not sure what types of assessments to include, or maybe you don't have a library full of those, first I would recommend feel free to email me. I have a number of informal resources that I'm happy to share with you. If you just shoot me an email, which we'll share our emails at the end that say, April, I would love your library of 504 resources. They include observation tools, student interviews, parent interviews, some systematic observation forms. There are some informal checklists for anxiety and ADHD that are in there. Feel free to utilize those. The second piece I will note is many of you may or may not be aware that the Tennessee Department of Education procured a digital assessment library. This was implemented this school year, starting in the summer. We went for full implementation in August. But there are a suite of 42 plus assessments that users can use across domains. So not only cognitive achievement, but a lot of social, emotional, and so a lot of anxiety measures, ADHD measures, behavioral measures, there's speech language, occupational assessments, fine and gross motor assessments. Honestly, there's a lot of assessments that could be utilized for free in that library. Now, your school psychologist, your speech language pathologist, and your SPED director probably all have access. So certainly reach out to them and utilize those staff as you need to collect some of these pieces as you're evaluating. Nothing requires that you have certain folks involved in the assessment process, But as you see here, we want to make sure that we can make a knowledgeable decision about the student through this process. And sometimes that may mean we need to loop in the school nurse to participate in the evaluation process. Maybe she's the expert on the disabling condition and we need her input. Maybe we need her to collect some observational data, or maybe we need her to collect some data of how often the student is visiting the nurse due to the disabling condition. There's a variety of other stakeholders that we can include in our evaluation process. Maybe it's not just the school psych and the school nurse. Maybe we need to include your school social worker or your school counselor. It depends on your specific district, but certainly loop in the folks that you need in order to, again, collect the data that is going to drive those decisions. Notice here that it does say information and results should be documented. If you're using our TM Pulse system, there are easy little boxes to include all of those assessment documentation pieces that you're deriving through your assessment process in order to print out and have readily available for your team and for your parent to review. So we know we're going to consider multiple pieces of data. We know that we're going to align those areas. And again, there's no restrictions on what types of assessment can be administered. I hear that quite often that, well, we're not allowed to administer potentially a cognitive battery because that feels like an IDA evaluation. Well, as we talked about before, there are some differences, but certainly some overlap. And in a lot of cases, for a lot of our students, even if they qualify under IDA or Section 504, any type of assessment would be necessary. And if you need it to help determine first eligibility under, do they have a disability that substantially limits? And then if you need that assessment to drive your development of the plan, we recommend that you obtain consent to collect those pieces. I see a question quickly about those assessments in the chat. I'm happy to drop those links. I would encourage you, all districts have access to this digital assessment library. So typically your account owner will be your special education director, or if you have a supervisor or coordinator, it could also be your lead psychologist or lead SLP. You will not more than likely be able to have access to that system if you do not meet the publisher requirements for those assessments. So if you are maybe a vice principal or a school counselor and you don't hold the right credentials, meaning that you are not an assessment specialist with the right training to access those assessments, you will not be able to go into that system. However, you absolutely can work with your teams who do have access to administer those assessments to your parents or to your students as needed. Okay, why did that disappear? There we go. So purpose of the evaluation, we know, is that we are going to use the evaluation results to determine if that child is eligible under Section 504. But certainly at a larger scale, we want to ensure that students are not misidentified, misclassified, or unnecessarily labeled. When we say students have a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits, we are saying they have a disability. And I think sometimes, and please help me, the school districts, sometimes we know that referrals come in just to get extended time on certain assessments, right? I get that. But we are going to consider those referrals in the same manner and in the same way that we would any other referral that we receive, and we're going to respond to that referral in an appropriate way. Just because you receive a referral doesn't mean you have to act on it. It means you must consider it and then respond to that parent in writing if you're going to either propose an evaluation or refuse it. So using that prior written notice or your meeting notes, which you can find all of those templates within TM Pulse, will be in your best interest to know if you don't suspect a disability and you don't want to misclassify your student as having a disability, you certainly can reject that. I want to also phrase out here in terms of accommodations. We get our two biggest areas that I get asked about when I'm doing these trainings are around extended time and read aloud. We get a lot of parent requests for those two accommodations. And many of you in this room are probably shaking your head saying, yes, I probably got that request last week from a parent that they want their child to have extended time or read aloud. So let's talk about how you can build out your assessment plan to collect the data that you need to either propose or refuse those accommodations for that student. Maybe you're going to ask your teams through the 60 days as you're collecting that information and your assessment data to offer the entire class opportunities to use extended time. And we're going to collect some data. Remember, we're going back to that definition and provision of FAPE under 504, an education comparable to non-disabled peers, not best, not worst. And I know sometimes our requests for accommodations are really based on, I want my child to be in the 99th percentile, right? That's not our standard under Section 504. It's comparable. And we all know that between the 25th and 75th percentile are considered average range, low average, average, high average. So looking at that bell curve, we know that gives us quite a range to ensure that we are providing that education comparable to non-disabled peers. And so as you're collecting information for that read aloud, maybe you're going to offer opportunities to have content read aloud to the students, and then you're going to collect how the student performed when they had the text read aloud versus when they were able to read independently. And then you're going to bring some of that redacted data to the 504 meeting to show, yeah, the student did actually perform comparably to other peers when they had access to read aloud, or they actually performed worse when they had access to read aloud. And here's the data that I've used to substantiate that. Extended time, again, is similar. Maybe we're going to offer opportunities for extended time, and you're going to collect data and have your teachers collect data to show how often the student accessed extended time or how quickly they finished. Many of our students who have recommendations for extended time, they do finish within the allotted time, and then we're sitting there waiting, right? Because we're required to give them that additional time and a half, whatever that team decides. And so if you have that data on the front end to be able to help support or refute not only eligibility, but what those the provision of those plans are, that is going to certainly be in your best interest. I'm so sorry. Chandrea, I keep clicking too high on your screen and opening your MSN box, and I don't know how to stop doing that. But if I just click on the screen, it will go for me. Okay. So who's making these decisions? We also know that the IEP team looks different than the 504 team. We know under an IEP team, we have a general education teacher, a SPED teacher, an LEA, the parent is required, and then other related service providers, including maybe a school psychologist, a speech language pathologist. Under Section 504, it looks a little bit differently. At minimum, it has to be the Section 504 coordinator, whether at district level or building level, the principal or LEA, and then other professionals knowledgeable about the student. So that may be your general education teacher, that could be your school nurse, that could be your school counselor, your school psych. It could be even, past teachers that had worked with this student. Keep in mind, as you note here, parents are listed on the should include, but we know we may proceed without parents if we've made every effort and documented those efforts to include them in our meetings. So these folks are the ones who will make ultimately the decision around eligibility under Section 504 and those decisions around the plan. So let's look at this scenario. I'm going to give you just a moment to read this, and then we will click over to the next slide. So it looks like, what do we do here? What do we think? Drop your, no, too far. Drop your response now that you've already seen it into the chat. And if you weren't paying attention and you were looking at your phone, now this is a good lesson in why you always should be paying attention so you could see the answer if April accidentally shared it too soon. Awesome. I'm seeing a lot of responses here. Perfect. All of you who were paying very close attention and heard earlier, I love it. Excellent job. I see all the B's. Yes. So probably we talked about this earlier. I guess I jumped the gun a bit. That yes, we know that we should be evaluating if we have reason to suspect a disability, we should move on that quickly. Procedurally, that's where districts err, is that you sit on a referral and you say, let's wait and see. Or in this case, well, maybe we're going to implement some interventions through RTIB and we're going to use RTI as a mechanism to delay or deny an evaluation. Be cautious of that. Those procedural issues also are under Section 504. If we suspect a disability, we should obtain consent and we should begin our evaluation. Excellent, excellent job, everyone. So we know that 504 does not provide that specific timeline. However, we know that they typically look to IDA. We lean into IDA where there's any ambiguity under Section 504, and we really talk about reasonableness. So we know both under IDA and then further defined under our state board rule, we say must be completed those initial evaluations within 60 calendar days of receipt of parental consent. I will carve that out here because if you're using our TN Pulse system, it's going to ask for you to confirm receipt of initial consent. Where districts err as well is that they will confirm receipt the day that maybe they sent home the initial consent. Remember, that's the day that you receive it is the day it comes back to you signed and completed, making sure that those dates align. Okay. So we know that when we're looking at all of our evaluative data, all of the rich information we've collected work samples, observations, maybe rating scales. We've collected a developmental history of this child. We know that there's maybe a family history of this. We've had the school nurse weigh in. Now, our first question that the team must respond to is, does this child have a disability under Section 504? And as Chandrea talked about before, you know that there are those three buckets to say they may have a disability, but does it rise to the level of substantially limiting one or more major life activities, thusly requiring the Section 504 plan? So as we think about what this looks like, let's look at what impairments could be. I am so sorry, folks. Either my mouse is not cooperating and you're probably seeing all of that. I hope you're not. So what is an impairment, folks? It could be anything. And they're not just medical issues. They could also be psychological issues that the child is struggling with. So, oh, that does not look right. So you see here that this is not an exhaustive list. I know I have worked with students who have qualified under Section 504 with gastrointestinal issues. I've had students who've had cancer who've qualified under Section 504. I've had students who had, as I mentioned before, concussions, traumatic brain injuries from falls or accidents. I've had students who've qualified for musculoskeletal because of being in an accident and breaking a leg, which then limited the child's ability to navigate the school building independently. Remember, as I'm talking, you should be hearing, okay, yeah, they have a disability. And now we know that it's limiting major life activities. It's not just limiting grades and their ability to master grade level content. We're talking about those major life activities, which may include learning and those other pieces, but it also could include those access pieces, all right? So you'll see here, this box is, I don't know why that does that, but intellectual disability, organic brain syndrome, if you're not familiar, those are, in my opinion, very outdated terminology for essentially Alzheimer's, dementia related. So those memory related neurological disorders, emotional mental illness, and specific learning disabilities. So truly, folks, anything can be included. And that's why it's important to always consider what parents are bringing you, because as I alluded to before, there are new diagnoses all the time. And you may get one from a parent and you may not have heard of it before. There's been several times where I've had to Google something and I'm like, I'm not familiar with that disorder diagnosis, medical issue. And you need to do your due diligence in terms of looping in the folks through that assessment process as necessary, and then considering each of those referrals on a case-by-case basis. So major life activities. Again, as we think about the disability in context of substantially limiting one or more of these, your assessment and your evaluation should collect data in order to capture how these major life activities are being impacted, because you have to be able to support why they're substantially impacted. And I must say, from a pragmatic perspective, that's difficult, right? What if it's a moderate impact and not a substantial impact, right? Or what if it's a mild impact? Your teams on a case-by-case basis get to determine what a substantial impact to these major life activities are. But the critical piece through all of this is that you have the evaluative data to support it. So let's think through an example real quick. Maybe a student, I will say in the state, based on the data that we have, the two top, actually, let me go to the three top, because we've had a huge insurgence of the third one, are disabling conditions served under 504 plans are diabetes, ADHD, and anxiety. Feel free, if you disagree in the chat, feel free to tell me if you think there's another one that you're seeing more prevalent than those three. But diabetes, ADHD, and anxiety are the top three that we're seeing. So let's take anxiety and let's take diabetes and look at those. So for diabetes, put into the chat box, what are some major life activities that could be impacted if a child was diagnosed with diabetes? What do you think? I see Tracy, yes. Physical activity, absolutely. Concentration, caring for oneself. Absolutely. And because of the low and high blood sugar, that's going to impact their ability to concentrate. They're going to get fatigued easily, perhaps. They're going to have trouble potentially caring for themselves. What if they're not able to assess their own blood sugar and they have to see the nurse because they're not able to do that? And then if their blood sugar gets low, now they have issues with concentrating, thinking, caring for oneself in terms of having to use the restroom repeatedly, especially if they're drinking a lot of water. Maybe their fatigue is going to be impacted, and so maybe it is going to impact their ability to lift or stand or run, right? Maybe some of our students with diabetes are not going to be able to have PE scheduled before lunch. Maybe we're going to have PE scheduled after lunch, or we're not going to be able to require them to run a mile. Maybe they're only going to be able to do a lap, right? So I love how you're thinking through all of the possibilities that could be impacted here. And now think back. What are some assessment components that you're going to collect to support how these major life activities are substantially impacted? Maybe a lot of observational data, maybe logs from the school nurse, maybe just input from the school nurse to know what types of care of plan, and reviewing that IHP perhaps. You may want to have the parent give you a release of information to talk to the doctor about prognosis and any other concerns that the doctor may have in a school setting, or what the doctor would recommend if you're going to take a field trip away from the building. certainly a release of information would be a good idea. You're going to get parent input, I hope. Why not talk to the student too and say, okay, all right, Johnny, we know that you have diabetes. What does this look like for you? When do you feel tired? When do you feel like this would be harder for you throughout the day? There's nothing wrong with doing an interview with the student and getting some information that way as well. So building out your assessment plan in order to capture what you need. Now let's flip over to a student with anxiety. So let's say it's generalized anxiety disorder. It's not one of these subtypes where it's really specific to a certain context. Generalized anxiety disorder. What are some potential major life activities that could be impacted for a student with generalized anxiety disorder? What do you think? I see learning, I think concentrating, communicating. I see, oh, excellent. Love it. I want to look at behaviors from that diagnosis, how it manifests in school. Absolutely. Staying in class, yeah. Be able to attend school regularly, absolutely. You are thinking so on the mark here, folks. It could be reading as well. So maybe that generalized anxiety disorder is going to impact a lot of these. So maybe let's think back. What if we're saying it's trouble learning? Well, maybe when students with the student who's presented new novel material shuts down, maybe has an anxiety attack and then has to have some time and space between new material. Maybe it's when they're introduced to new teachers, or there's a substitute that day, or there's new students in the classroom, or maybe when it's during unstructured time that the student, and all of these pieces, you're going to be collecting evidence to support of how it impacts them. And maybe it's when they're given a timed assessment. And so we know we've collected data to show any time they have been put under a time constraint, they shut down, which then impacts their ability to complete tasks and concentrate, right? It could be their ability. Somebody mentioned this about communication. I love that, especially if we ask them to work in a small group or with pairs, and then that is really what gets them going and they feel very uncertain of how to do that. That's a great piece for you to document, not only maybe through your observations, but that student interview, talking to the teacher of when maybe some of these episodes have occurred. All of this is going to be such good, rich data for you and your teams to consider. All of you are spot on. Now, folks, I do want to say you must have at least one major life activity that is substantially limiting in order to draft the plan. TM Pulse will actually throw an error code if you don't select anything. You have to be able to link the disability to at least one major life activity and say that there's a substantial limitation for a plan to be drafted. And that's just, I think, good policy, right? Because Chandrea mentioned, you must have a mental or physical impairment, but then it must substantially limit one or more major life activities in order to justify the plan, okay? So substantial limitations. I think I alluded to this before. I'm sorry, I keep jumping the gun here, folks. It doesn't mean, again, that you can't do it. Think back to my child that had leukemia actually, and she was undergoing chemotherapy for her treatments, and she was absolutely able to come to school and learn. She just couldn't do it throughout the entire duration of the day. She wasn't able to perform certain tasks that were physically taxing. So PE, again, similar to the example with the student with diabetes, PE had to be parsed down significantly, but that also included music class, because we found that her music class also really required a lot of physical ability to beat on drums or to play certain instruments. And then recess also had to be accommodated through that. It didn't mean she couldn't go to PE and then she couldn't go to music and she couldn't go to recess. But our plan then had to support her during that time and make provisions to allow her full access to participate, while also acknowledging that her disability prevented her from doing all of the same things that other students could do. It's really important for us us to consider that condition, manner, duration of these major life activities. And then always, we keep saying this, I feel like if I'm ever brave enough to get a tattoo, it will say on a case-by-case basis. Everything should be made on a case-by-case basis. Just because you gave this accommodation for a student with a similar disability last time doesn't mean that you're going to do it this upcoming time. It needs to be all driven by the data that you've collected and by the need of the student to receive an education comparable to non-disabled peers. So let's look at another You Be the Judge here. What do you think in terms of reading this, and then we'll go to the next page, and I promise I will not give you the answer before we keep going. All right, I'm going to gently go to the next screen. What should the teachers do? What do you think? Throw your answer into the chat, A, B, C, or D. Awesome. I see a lot of responses. Perfect, perfect. You are doing great. So let's go. You are right on the money. Absolutely. Speak to that 504 coordinator, determine about that evaluation to determine if that disability. Remember, before the child can receive a plan, they must be evaluated. We can't do one without the other. The evaluation can't be missing, and we just, surprisingly give the child a plan. We must evaluate, and it is our obligation to evaluate prior to determining eligibility and then drafting that plan. So we get this question a lot. April, what can go into a 504 plan? Really, a lot of things, okay? You see here accommodations, modifications, and related services. So we know accommodations, modifications pretty well. You know that these are not exhaustive lists, but sometimes there are folks who don't realize that related services can also be provided through a Section 504 plan. So remember what I said way at the beginning. 504 is all about access, right? So what if, go back to my example of a child who breaks his leg getting into a car accident. He typically drove himself to and from school, but the break in his leg was his right leg, and he could no longer drive. His mother worked from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., and she was unable to bring him to school. Could the school district, through his 504 plan, determine if special transportation is necessary in order for the student to access general education? Potentially. We also could embed nursing services for students who require nursing support through their 504 plan and IHP. Speech language, occupational therapy. It could be counseling. It could be physical therapy. It could be an aid. All of those could be provided through a 504 plan. What I would encourage you to do is, before you go tomorrow and input these services into a 504 plan, is to consult with your special education director. Many of these faculty are paid through federal funds, and it could be problematic because 504 plans and practitioners who are funded through IDA would be available to evaluate, but they may not be eligible to serve the child. And I see a question in the chat about who pays for these services. The school district does. If a child requires these related services in order to access their general education environment, then the school district is required under state and federal law to provide them. And I know, as we said, that 504 has no funding source. So this does raise some complications, correct? And this is where I would just remind you, folks, if you have students who rise to the level of needing speech language services, OT, PT services due to a potentially orthopedic impairment, do your due diligence and potentially recommend that there is an IDA evaluation to determine if they are eligible under IDA. Because one, those do derive funds, right, from state and federal sources. But certainly if they don't qualify under there, but they still require them under Section 504 in order to meet that provision of FAPE, then your district would have to pay for those services. So I know we allude to this a lot. I think we'll have to, at some point, maybe change up the settings of these. Is a medical diagnosis, this is the number, I will say this is the number one question I get from districts and the number one complaint I hear from parents. Is a medical diagnosis required to qualify under Section 504? Yes, no, I'm not sure. Throw it into the chat. Thank you for using all caps. No, no, no. You folks are doing awesome today. Gold stars all the way around. So no, records of those students' medical diagnoses may be considered, right? This could be your child find piece where you get information around a student's diagnosis, but they are not required to qualify. You should not require a parent to bring you an outside diagnosis before you will consider an evaluation. And you cannot require them to bring you a diagnosis in order to qualify a student. So let's back that up here. Let's go back to our top three: diabetes, anxiety, and ADHD. Well, we haven't picked on ADHD a lot yet, so let's pick on ADHD. Let's say your teachers suspect ADHD. The parent refuses to consider taking the child to their primary care physician, and so your team still suspects and have gotten consent to evaluate. Well, April, are you telling us we have to diagnose ADHD? No, I'm not saying you're diagnosing the actual impairment. What you're doing is you're collecting information that you bring back to your team so your team can consider if the signs and symptoms appear to be consistent with that diagnosis. And then you're going to serve that student through the plan based on those signs and characteristics and that symptomatology that you derive through your evaluation. And that may include, again, looping in your school psych or your school social worker. Folks, we have a ton of evaluations to look at ADHD, to look at anxiety, to look at depression, any of those other mental health concerns. Loop in the faculty that you need in order to capture and collect the data that you require. Now, this should be an easy answer, but let's see and test your knowledge, team. Does having a medical diagnosis automatically qualify you under 504 or for a 504 plan? Now, we know Chandrea talked a lot about this. Having a medical diagnosis may trigger the procedural protections around 504, but never, never, never does it automatically qualify a student under Section 504, okay? So medical diagnosis, again, may trigger an evaluation, but it does not automatically qualify. And I will say this too, because this has come up in a question on a previous 504 training that Chandrea and I have done. What if through your evaluation, you do need a medical evaluation to appropriately plan the student's 504 plan? Then you need to consult both with the parent, and if the parent refuses to take, or the parent doesn't refuse to take, but they don't have means, whether through transportation or fiscal means, to obtain a medical evaluation, then again, whatever we require of parents should be at no cost to them. And that may mean that the district needs to consult and collaborate with the mental or medical professional out in the community and establish a contract in order to provide whatever type of medical evaluation the team thinks is necessary to determine eligibility and then plan the plan. Okay. Mitigating measures. So this is a mouthful, but I'm going to read it to you just because I think it's helpful when you hear it out loud. So this is since January 1st, 2009, LEAs must not consider the ameliorating effects of any mitigating measures. Say that 3 times fast, right? So let me give you this example. So Johnny is being evaluated for ADHD. Consent has been signed. There is no diagnosis that the parent provided. So we're doing a lot of rating scales and doing additional observations to see time on task, organization, task completion, those types of things. And about 30 days into your 60-day timeline, the teacher comes to you and says, April, it's a miracle. Johnny has turned in all of his work. He has an organized desk. We're not sure what happened. I assume that there was some type of miracle that occurred. So you're curious. You're an investigative soul. You call the parent and you say, hey, we noticed some marked improvements in Johnny. What's going on? And the parent says, oh, I forgot to tell you. About 2 weeks ago, we did take him to his primary care and they did diagnose ADHD and they put him on a psychostimulant. And I'm assuming it's just kicking in. Well, now you get to your meeting and are you considering, based on what I just read, are you considering Johnny pre-medication or post-medication in order to determine eligibility? What do you think? Drop it into chat. Pre-medication or post-medication? Rock stars. All of you are rock stars. Love it. I see so many that are putting in pre. That is correct. We're not going to consider any mitigating measure in order to determine eligibility. And you'll notice here, this is not an exhaustive list, but medication is considered a mitigating measure because we all know with medication, don't they change? One day the child's taking it, the next day the child's not, or they like to play with the levels and the dosage, or they change from one medication to another medication, and then ultimately maybe the parent pulls them off the medication altogether because of the adverse side effects, right? We must consider Johnny pre-medication in order to determine eligibility. Now, think back to Chandrea. She talked about those situations where they're eligible, but they don't require a plan, right? That technically eligible piece is so important here when we're considering mitigating measures. Because if we're considering eligibility under Johnny pre-medication, and then he doesn't require a plan currently, but then something changes, guess what? He's already eligible in the system, and all we have to do is go back in, update that tab of technically eligible, and now guess what? We can draft that plan and we don't have to start all over. So keep that in mind when you think through situations around technically eligible. I will say you're not required in the TN Pulse system to have every single student with a disability in that system in order to identify them as technically eligible. I would use that function on a case-by-case basis in order to keep that student's eligibility active, in order to have your team ready in the wings in case you need to get that plan active and implemented, okay? So again, I defer to your policies, procedures, practices in your districts about using that functionality and what that will look like for your district. But as you see here, we cannot consider any of these ameliorating that lessening effects of any of these mitigating measures, okay? And so if students are using, you'll see prosthetics here. If they're using a device or a limb and they are wheelchair bound, we have to consider them essentially without that device. If we took that from them today, would they qualify and would they need these services, right? And so in most cases, we would say yes, right? We would need to supply that. So keep that in mind as you're thinking through eligibility and the development of plan with your students. Transitory impairment. I got a few more slides. I'm going to pass it back over to Chandra in a moment. I know that I hope my team has been looking at the chat, because with all of our questions that I've been posing to the team, I think we probably have lost some questions. So transitory impairment. An individual is not regarded as having a disability if that impairment is considered to be transitory minor. And how that definition reads is essentially if it's the actual or expected duration is 6 months or less. So let me give you a few examples, because we always hear this around March, April when we're getting ready to do TCAP season, right? Is Johnny was, pretending to be Evel Knievel. He was climbing in a tree and then he fell. He broke his dominant writing hand or his arm, and he's no longer able to complete the assessment where he's writing out his essay responses. It's not going to last 6 months or longer. Folks, we serve students, we don't serve eligibility categories. And even though in that case that it is transitory, I certainly think it's in your best interest and really in the best interest of the child to go through your 504 process, evaluate, determine eligibility, and then serve that student to provide them the appropriate accommodations to complete the assessment. But another example could be what we got a lot of questions during COVID around this. Is COVID a transitory impairment? And then once long COVID came out, COVID itself is probably considered a transitory impairment, but long COVID may not be. So again, always on a case-by-case basis, really understanding how that disability impacts that student short-term, long-term, as you make considerations around eligibility and potential services for that student. My final slide here, we talked about this already, but don't forget, conduct those reevaluations periodically before that change of placement. The reevaluations, there's nothing that requires you to go back and assess in every single area that you assessed in before. But you do need to consider what information or data do you need to collect to, again, determine if the child has a disability, and then how does that disability continue to impact a major life activity substantially. And so we always encourage you to collect some level of data through those reevaluation processes, even if it's just updated teacher information, talking with the student, talking with the parent to really drive that decision-making process. I would always strongly encourage you not to just roll things from one series to the next without really doing some due diligence to consider what is appropriate for that student. I'll give you this example. We were working with a school district who they only serve secondary students. And so we were doing some work. They had a new 504 coordinator. We were trying to support them. And so they were holding 504 meetings and determining how they were going to do these annual reevaluations and the annual reviews of the plans. And as we started to conduct these meetings, the 504 coordinator started to invite the students to these meetings, and lo and behold, these students were not accessing any of their accommodations. They did not understand that they needed a plan. And not only were they not accessing, but the accommodations weren't necessary, right? They weren't necessary in order to access general education. And so just saying that they need a plan year after year, make sure you have the data to support the continuation of that plan. And the data is what drives the team's decision-making process. It's not, we always say this in IDA, and I think it's probably true here in 504, we don't make decisions on hopes, feelings, wishes, dreams. We make decisions based on current and valid data that your team is collecting. And so I would always encourage you, bring the folks that you need to the table to collect those pieces in order to propose propose or refuse really a strong plan for those students to provide that education comparable to non-disabled peers. Chandrea, Courtney, Nikki, did you see any other questions come in? I was trying to scroll back and I'm not seeing much.
I think I saw one question in the chat, April. I'm not sure if this one was addressed, but it was asking about outside counseling. If outside counseling services could be considered a mitigating measure that an LEA, wouldn't necessarily take into consideration when determining if a student fits the eligibility criteria under Section 504 and may need a Section 504 plan. And just wanted to be sure we address this one. I'll go ahead and share a response. I think it could be considered a mitigating measure. If we go back to that list that April shared, I think it would be possibly an accommodation or related service. It would probably fall into that category. So not necessarily medication or some kind of equipment or some kind of device that a student would use, but I think it could possibly be considered some form of a related service that's being provided to the student outside of the school setting. April, any thoughts on that one?
No, I absolutely agree with that. And I think you're wise, Amanda, to consider that as a mitigating measure and then just documenting in the student's eligibility and then in your prior notice meeting notes that you're not going to draft a plan, but if anything changes with those outside counseling services, then you may need to reconvene your team. I think that's a great question.
Okay. And then I see one more question. I think this is about the U.S. Department of Education's website. Just noting that some of the links are no longer available on that website. Definitely do understand that concern. We've noticed that as well as it relates to some of the FAQ documents that may have been available on the website. We can share with you all information about where some items may be archived, and I think Courtney and Nikki may be rounding some of that up as well. But thank you for just letting us know that. Rhonda, and if you have any questions about information that is on the website, whether or not it's still current, if anything has possibly changed, or if new guidance has been issued, or if anything has even been rescinded as well, feel free to reach out to our team and we can definitely provide you with some information about what we know may be happening with guidance documents and materials that are usually available on the U.S. Department of Education's website. Okay, we'll go ahead and transition into this next section. I'm covering two parts here, you all, so discipline, and then we'll move into our other considerations. We're going to pause and take a break after this discipline section. So a break is coming soon, you all. I think we'll be probably about 20-30 minutes away from our next break. So thinking about discipline under Section 504, the first thing that we want to cover here is manifestation determination reviews. As we think about MDRs for students with disabilities, we're going to see that there are some commonalities under Section 504 is what we see with special education under IDEA and our state laws as well. LEAs must conduct an evaluation of any person who needs or is believed to need special education and related services before taking any action with respect to the initial placement of the person and any subsequent significant change in placement. That is the language in the Section 504 regulations that really points to the need for manifestation determination reviews. The regulations don't use that phrase like we see in IDEA, but this language that speaks about conducting an evaluation before a significant change in placement, that is our MDR language under Section 504. And here, as we see from this language, it's going to be required before we have that significant change in placement, not just for our students who we've identified as students with disabilities, but also for those who are suspected of being individuals with disabilities as well. So who serves on this MDR team? When we have made it to this point where we are determining that there is a significant change in placement that may need to happen, and when we're thinking about significant change in placement under Section 504, we're going to think about 10 or more consecutive days, or where we have the series of days that are going to add up to the 10-day exclusion from the 10 days of exclusionary discipline from the educational setting as well. And when we are moving into our assessment, we want to be sure that we have the right folks at the table to make decisions about what is going to be necessary for our students. The MDR team should include people knowledgeable about the student, the meaning of the evaluation data, and the placement options. This information should look very similar to what April shared with you all about who is going to be a member of the student Section 504 committee or that Section 504 team. So very similar folks, likely that same team should be involved in that process. And we want to be sure that we have representatives who really understand all three elements there. When we think about this MDR and why it's necessary, it's going to be used to determine whether the student's conduct was caused by or related to their physical or mental impairment. That is our ultimate goal of what we're trying to determine. And we're also trying to get some understanding of, is the conduct that the student has engaged in, is it also due to a failure of the school to properly implement the student Section 504 plan as written as well? So really, we're wanting to understand what was the cause behind the student's inappropriate conduct. Was it related to their disability? Or was it due to that failure to properly implement the services under the Section 504 plan? That takes us to another you be the judge scenario. I'll pause, give you all an opportunity to read this slide, and then we'll move into our multiple choice options. And I see a great question that came to the chat about student discipline. We'll talk about that after our scenario. So thank you for adding the question, Anthony. Okay, so here we have Ethan. He's a ninth grade student. He struggles with impulse control and understanding social expectations. He is neurodivergent, but he doesn't have an IEP or a Section 504 plan. He's considered a general education student. The school has a strict policy about anyone with 3 write-ups automatically gets after-school detention. We see that he currently has 2 write-ups in his pre-algebra class. He receives his next write-up for excessive moving, and the principal is now considering him for the after-school detention the following day. Ethan's mother calls the school, reminds the principal of his condition, and the principal tells her that the after-school detention policy applies to all students. Ethan's mom objects and accuses the school of disability-based discrimination. Did the school discriminate against this student in this particular situation? Okay, I'm seeing folks adding their responses. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of B's, a lot of A's too, and a couple of C's that are being added to the chat. Let's see who has the correct answer here. This one is actually maybe. So my folks who said A, you're going to be correct here in that assessment. And let's talk about why. There could be a possibility that the school is engaging in discriminatory conduct by applying this policy to a student like Ethan, or why this may not be discriminatory. So Section 504 does not prohibit schools from disciplining students with disabilities. However, when schools discipline students, they must do so in a non-discriminatory manner. That means that a school's policy or practice is going to be neutral on its face, and that even if it is neutral on its face, that it must not unjustifiably discriminate by denying a student with a disability meaningful access to the school's aids, benefits, or services, and must not exclude that student because of their disability. In our scenario, if we think about how Ethan's particular disability, even though he didn't have a 504 plan or an IEP, but this student was a student who was neurodivergent. If we think about how his disability manifested with him having concerns about just being able to stay on task or remain still during the day, and all of the disciplinary actions taken against him were because of that particular conduct. That could be a policy that is applied in a discriminatory manner, because essentially here, this student would have been being subjected to discipline because of conduct related to his disability. I know I spoke about MDRs at the start. This particular scenario did not include any need for a manifestation determination review, because we did not see a significant change in placement for this student. We did not see an instance where the student was going to be placed in some exclusionary or be subject to exclusionary discipline for the 10 or more days. But let's take this scenario and let's say that we have Ethan, who has accumulated 5 days where he is already being subjected to maybe in-school suspension for this conduct, or conduct that is completely unrelated to his disability of being neurodivergent. And now he's committed conduct where he's facing a 10-day suspension. In that instance, because we see that he has engaged in conduct where maybe he was placed in ISS for 5 days at an earlier point in the school year, we are now approaching an instance where he's going to be subjected to a 10-day suspension because of this new conduct that he's engaged in. But this conduct, let's say, it's similarly related. Let's say the 5 days that he was subjected to before was for some kind of off-task behavior in the classroom, disruptive behavior in the classroom, and now he's made it to this 10-day suspension, the possibility of the 10-day suspension because of the continued disruptive behavior. We see this conduct is going to be similar conduct, and this student is facing the 10 or more days of exclusionary discipline. That's where we're going to have a need for conducting a manifestation determination review for this student. And I'm using this example of where he's been already included in an in-school suspension setting, because we often get questions about whether or not students who have been participating in in-school suspension, whether or not that would be considered exclusionary discipline. And when we think about exclusionary discipline, we're really thinking about whether or not the student is having access to their same age non-disabled peers. Kristen, I see your question about if exclusionary discipline, or is it exclusionary discipline if it's after school? In our scenario, we were talking about an after-school detention. In the scenario I'm presenting now, I'm talking about an in-school suspension of the student where he would be removed away from his non-disabled peers. And in that instance, if we're thinking about the 5 days of in-school suspension coupled with the 10 days of out-of-school suspension, there may be a need for us to conduct the manifestation determination review there. Also, I want to go back to a question that we had come up when the scenario was first presented. I believe Anthony added a question to the chat. If a student is caught vaping and the vape does test positive for THC or any other illegal drug, does the MDR have to be completed? That's a great question. I was actually just researching some information under Section 504 related to illegal drug use and alcohol use of students. It is going to be an instance there where likely the MDR is not going to be required. There is a provision under Section 504 that speaks about students engaging in illegal drug use or using alcohol and them being subject to the school's discipline policies without receiving the protections of the procedural safeguards. So that could be an instance where an MDR is not going to be necessary for a student under Section 504, but there are some exceptions built into that provision as well that really consider whether or not the student has been in some kind of treatment program, or if the student is actively seeking treatment as well. So those are some things to consider. Very fact-specific situation there. You really want to work with your board attorney as you are working through any of these situations, especially when it involves some kind of illegal substance on your campus, because there may be more reporting requirements that are necessary under our state law as well, as it relates to just ensuring that that type of conduct is reported to the appropriate authorities. But you really want to look at the facts to determine just what is happening with this particular student, if they're engaging in use of those substances on your campus, and if after that review you've determined that they've engaged in the use on your campus and they don't qualify under an exception, then the discipline could be issued without regard to a manifestation determination review in that instance.
Chandrea, do you mind if I say one thing about that?
Yes, go ahead.
I will always say, and if you've ever heard me do our IDA MDR training, it never is a problem and it doesn't hurt anything if you hold an MDR when one is not necessary. So let's say all of the provisions that Chandrea just mentioned, you're not really supposed to hold one because that's that carve out given illicit substances. And you're not supposed to. Nothing hurts your team or any of the process if you hold one. But procedurally, where districts can misstep if you fail to hold an MDR when you needed an MDR. So certainly, as Chandrea said, consult your local board attorney. But again, always keep in mind that just procedurally, we would rather you hold one if you're not certain versus if you fail to hold one and you did need to hold an MDR. Chandrea, is that a fair statement?
No, and I think that is a fair assessment as well. We can share and Anthony, I see your follow-up question. We can share the actual federal provision that speaks about that exclusion for the application of the procedural safeguards to students who are engaging in that illegal conduct on campus. And we can also share some resources from Special Education Connection related to that as well. And April, definitely agree. I believe in even reviewing those resources from Special Education Connection. They spoke about how the district is not going to face or be subject to any kind of liability for conducting the MDR. It's, really you're erring on the safe side if you do conduct the MDR, but the regulations just specifically call out that in this instance, it's not required. Okay, so I told you all we had about 20 minutes left. Let me see, I want to be sure we're answering all questions. Let's see. Okay, so Kristen, I see your question. If you hold an MDR and it's determined that the disability was the root cause, does that mean no punishment, different consequences, or something else entirely? Okay, so Kristen, I'll ask April for input on this one as well. So if we determine that the student's conduct is caused by the disability or it's related to the disability, then you wouldn't necessarily apply your discipline policy, right? So if the student was facing, let's say, a 3-day out of school suspension, or our student in our earlier scenario of the 10-day out of school suspension, then you wouldn't apply that discipline policy to that situation. But what you want to do in that instance is convene your team to think about what additional supports may this student need to ensure that this conduct does not occur. Again, how can they be supported in ensuring that they know how to address this conduct or limit their engagement or desire to engage in this type of conduct as well? And really thinking about, is there's something that definitely needs to be addressed by updating the students' services, their accommodations, their related aids and services, whatever it may be, to really support that student. April, anything to add to that?
No, that's perfect. Yeah. So really when we think about the outcomes of this is, yes, if that disability had a direct or substantial relationship to the misconduct, then we can't apply those same disciplinary consequences, and we need to return them from the placement from which they were removed. But if it is not a manifestation, then yes, you can still apply those same disciplinary consequences in the same manner and the same duration. But you just need to make provisions to continue that student to allow access to the curriculum and whatever potential services may be listed in their 504 plan. But that's spot on. Yeah.
And I'll add as well, thinking about some of those suspension services and suspension terms. And I know, April, we've addressed this in presentations before as well, when folks may ask about if a student who has a Section 504 plan, if they are still entitled to their educational services when they are subject to exclusionary discipline. Think about, what are you providing your general education students? Our students who have IEPs, they're always going to be entitled to those services. But for Section 504, we want to think about, what are we providing our students who are general education students, our non-disabled students during that time? And if the educational services aren't being provided there, or even if we're thinking about maybe transportation services because the student is going to be remanded to the alternative setting. If we're not providing those transportation services for our general education students, it may not be necessary to provide it under Section 504 as well. Remember, this is an accessibility law, right? This is the civil rights law. So our goal is to ensure that we're providing equal access as we do for our students who are our general education students and these students with disabilities, non-disabled peers. But we'll go ahead and move into our last section about the 504 overview, covering other considerations. So some of these have been mentioned earlier during the training. We're just going to give you really some highlights related to some frequently asked questions that we receive from school districts. So health-related services. Generally, Section 504 obligates LEAs to provide students with disabilities health-related services that are required to be performed during the day that allow for daily attendance. That could be things such as administering medication to students, or allowing the students to take medication during the school day, visit the school nurse and take that medication, allowing students to measure or to assess their different health needs during the day as well. Any kind of self-care, whether that be related to additional rest breaks or additional restroom opportunities as well. And then changes in any needs related to dietary needs as well, whether it be modifications to school meals, or allowing the student to bring specific food items for school meals, or also even allowing students time to receive some additional food during the day, or to take some additional or eat some additional food during the day if it is something that supports with their health needs. A little bit more detail on special diets. If food is provided to all students, it must be provided to students with special dietary needs on the same basis as is provided to those students' non-disabled peers. Again, that goes back to meal modifications that may be necessary for students who have those special dietary needs. And again, an LEA must also allow snacks for students who have those health needs that may require them to have a snack or have some kind of food item during the day to just help them manage their health. Particularly here, we're thinking about students with diabetes. But in those cases, the LEA is not required to provide that snack or food for those students. And that's unless it's a time where the LEA is providing snacks for all students, right? So if you are in the elementary school setting, and let's say that you all provide an afternoon snack, maybe around 2 or 3 p.m. For your students at the end of the day. If you're providing those snacks for all of your students throughout your school, then you need to also have some options for students with disabilities who may have special dietary needs, and provide those snacks as well for maybe our students who have diabetes and need an extra snack during the day to help manage their blood sugar levels, right? Also, as we are thinking about the LEA's obligations to provide, or where LEAs may not be provided or may not be required to provide any snacks, this also extends to programming outside of the school day as well. So if we are thinking about some kind of extracurricular activities, if we're thinking about some club meetings, or any kind of like celebrations that may be associated with an athletic team, if there are snacks or food being provided for non-disabled students or for all students, then we're going to need to ensure that we're providing snacks and food for students with disabilities, and ensuring that we are taking into account special dietary needs for students as well. With this question, we also get lots of inquiries about class parties, right? Particularly for our elementary school students. And what you want to think about when you are just providing guidance to your classroom teachers related to class parties is ensuring too that in those instances, if they are providing snacks or treats for all students, that they must have some options that are available for students with special dietary needs, or that our students with disabilities are also able to access the foods and snacks or treats that are available. Individual health plans, I talked a bit about these at the start when we were talking about what students would be or would be students with qualifying disabilities under Section 504, and which students would meet that definition of a student with a disability under Section 504. A student with an individual health plan will be a student with a disability, but unless through an evaluation process, it's been indicated that that student's disability substantially limits one or more major life activity, and the student has that Section 504 plan, then that student is not necessarily going to be a student who's served under Section 504 with those accommodations and related aids and services. Health plans should never be used to substitute Section 504 plans. So if it's been determined that the student does meet that criteria, if their disability substantially limits one or more major life activity, then we should really be evaluating under Section 504 and ensuring that we are developing an appropriate plan for that student. There may be instances where a student could have both a health plan and a Section 504 plan to meet their needs, but look to your district's policies and practices to determine if that is an appropriate practice in your district, or if you are in a district where you've taken on the process of building out that information in the student Section 504 plan, and ensuring that all parties who may need that information have access to that information as well, that supports with the services that the student is receiving. Services that are provided in the health plan are usually going to be those mitigating measures. So think about some of the things that April talked about earlier related to administering medication, or ensuring that students have opportunities for rest breaks or bathroom breaks, right? Or assisting students with some kind of devices or equipment that may support with their disabilities as well. And remember that those mitigating measures cannot be considered in determining eligibility under Section 504. Again, LEAs with that practice of placing students on a health plan and not evaluating under Section 504, you really want to reevaluate and revisit that process to ensure that if those students are meeting eligibility criteria under Section 504, that they are being evaluated and a plan is developed for those students and then properly implemented. Attendance. We get lots of questions about attendance as it relates to Section 504. And here are a couple of important things that you want to remember. So students receiving special education services or provided protections under Section 504 may need modifications to their schedules. There may be a need for the students to attend on part-time days or alternating days, or a specific amount of time indicated in their IEP or Section 504 plan. You really want to ensure that your team is making those decisions with careful consideration when they are considering just modifying a student schedule in any way, when it is a student with a 504 plan and a student with an IEP as well, and ensuring that any shortening of the day is done in a manner in which the student is going to continue to receive FAPE. If that student is going to need the shortened day, you want to ensure that the schedule is still going to be built in a way that allows the student to receive FAPE, and that if there is any service being missed or any instance where the student is not receiving FAPE because of some modifications that have been made to the student's schedule, that there's an opportunity for compensatory education as well. School districts are strongly encouraged to consider different supports or accommodations that will allow a student to remain in school or return to that full day as soon as possible. So again, be sure that you are really assessing what the student's needs are in these situations before considering modifying a schedule. Homebound is another kind of pseudo attendance question that we get from districts related to Section 504. And remember that in Tennessee, a student may need homebound for one of two reasons. It may be a medical homebound, in which the instruction is provided in the home or at a hospital or at other related locations for children who are unable to attend school due to a medical condition. This could be because the student is medically fragile, or it could be an educational homebound. And this is going to be a type of homebound service that the student's IEP or 504 team has determined is going to allow for the student to receive instruction in the home, a hospital, or related setting, and that the homebound setting is the student's least restrictive environment. Students' behavioral needs may require instruction in the home. That could be an example of when an educational homebound is needed. And one thing that April and I always mention when we give this presentation and we speak about educational homebound for students with 504 plans is really, if you're considering educational homebound for a student with a Section 504 plan because of that student's disability and because there's a concern that the student's least restrictive environment would be that homebound setting, you may want to consider evaluating that student under IDEA to determine if the specialized instruction is needed for that student. It can be done. The law allows for educational homebound for students with a 504 plan, but those instances are going to be very rare, very rare. Also, with homebound, it's important to remember that when we are thinking about students who have been placed on homebound services, like with students with IEPs, students with Section 504 plans, they need to have those plans or those homebound placements reviewed every 30 days to ensure the continued appropriateness of instruction in that homebound placement. And that's the requirement for the educational homebound. With the medical homebound, ensure that you are complying with the state board rule related to reviewing those and receiving the information from the student's medical professional. Our state board rule was updated a few years ago to really call out the differences between the medical homebound and the educational homebound. So please look there, and Nikki or Courtney will add that state board rule to the chat as well, just ensuring that everyone has that information. But please look there for clarity on how the medical homebound process should operate with regards to who should be involved in the decision making, what information is needed from the student's medical professional, and how often those placements should be revisited as well. A question that we've gotten pretty frequently here in the last year or so has been related to students transferring with a 504 plan. And this goes for students transferring from one district in Tennessee to another district in Tennessee, and then students transferring into a school district in Tennessee, maybe from out of state as well. You want to ensure that you are avoiding the denial of FAPE when a student transfers in your district. There may be a need to provide comparable services while you wait on an evaluation, or while you're waiting on the results of an evaluation and developing a plan or an IEP for a student. So be sure to provide those comparable services when a student is transferring into your district from out of state and is being evaluated. And if a student is transferring into your district from another district in Tennessee, and you are determining whether or not there's a need for an evaluation there, provide the comparable services based on the student's records that you've received from the parent or from the LEA that they're transferring from as well. We get lots of questions about post-secondary as well. I think most of these questions probably come from parent interactions. So either parents reaching out to the department or parents reaching out to an LEA related to the concerns that have been presented by a student getting ready to transition into post-secondary, or a parent having concerns about whether or not their child is going to be able to continue to receive their services under Section 504 in post-secondary. Or even if a student has an IEP, if there needs to be a change to a student from an IEP to a Section 504 plan, because maybe the parent has heard that, oh, well, the IEP doesn't go with the student when they enter college, but they can't have a Section 504 plan. So you need to transition them to a Section 504 plan. So a few things to remember as it relates to post-secondary. Colleges and universities that receive federal assistance, they are covered by Section 504, and they are required to follow all of the requirements under Section 504, but they are not required to adopt the student Section 504 plan implemented by the student's LEA. So they're not required to implement and adopt that K-12 504 plan. When students transition to the post-secondary level, the college or university, they're going to have their own criteria for evaluating students. They're going to have their own process. They're going to have their own procedural safeguards. And parents are going to need to work with the post-secondary institution to determine what are the next steps, or the students, if they're of age, they're going to need to work with the post-secondary institution to determine next steps if they are wanting the student evaluated and a plan possibly implemented at the post-secondary level. And whenever you get these sorts of inquiries, you want to be sure to consult with your board attorney and your director of schools to ensure that you are actually responding to these inquiries appropriately. And the same goes for dual enrollment placements as well. We've gotten a few questions here lately about a student who maybe is participating in a dual enrollment program with their local college or university. They are receiving services under a 504 plan while they are attending classes at their high school, and they are wanting to ensure that that service plan also applies to the dual enrollment course that they're taking. Consult with your board attorney and your director of schools on how to navigate those questions. There may be a need for some collaboration with the post-secondary institution that's offering the dual enrollment for them to share information with the student's parents or the student about how to be assessed on the post-secondary level under their policies and procedures. But remember, for those situations, those are really situations that you want to ensure that you have the right folks involved in the decision-making and what you're communicating back with students and their families as well. So I think we have maybe some questions, and April, Nikki, Courtney, help me out. I think we have some questions in the chat. I want to take those before we move into our next scenario. Okay, so I see one question. It says, we have over 300 students with IHPs for diabetes, but no limited educational issues. Do all of them need a 504 also? So I would say in this instance, Judy, it will really depend on the student's individual needs, right? So as you all are looking at each of these students, if any of these students have, if their diabetes substantially limits one or more major life activity, those major life activities that April covered earlier, then those students would need a 504 plan. But for those other students who are able to manage their diabetes throughout the day and it's not substantially limiting one or more major life activity, they may not. They may be able to just operate with the individual health plan and the services that are covered there. And they may not need those additional supports with any accommodations or related aids and services under Section 504. Okay. And I see, oh, and Judy, I answered your question, but I see your next message. You said, you think I answered it above when you said have an IHP, we need to evaluate to see if the 504 is needed. Exactly. We do, and some of these students do have a 504. Okay. Okay, no, glad to know that some of those students have a 504, but not all of those students are going to have a 504 because it may not be necessary. Let's see. So a post-secondary question. Does the same apply for students in dual enrollment classes? Okay, we answered that in our second bullet point. Okay, and it looks like Nikki has also shared the state board rule regarding homebound services as well and homebound placements. Am I missing anything? Any questions missed?
I don't think so. I think you got them all, Chandrea.
Okay, great. Okay, and those were asked and answered, so glad to see. So let's move into our last scenario here, you all, and then we're going to wrap up. So take a moment to read this fact pattern, and then we'll take a look at our answer choices. Okay, so here we have a scenario about a student enrolled in dual enrollment. We have Andy, who has a 504 plan and receives related services in her high school classes, but her college professors don't provide the same services. We see that towards the end of the semester, Andy has not submitted all of her assignments for her dual enrollment class. The high school's 504 coordinator met with Andy and advised that she worked with the instructor of the dual enrollment class. Additionally, the principal told the parent that because it was a privilege for Andy to attend the college classes through the dual enrollment program, it's Andy's responsibility to complete her assignments and contact the college's disability services for assistance. Our question here, did the LEA response violate Section 504? Did the LEA's response violate Section 504? Okay, let's see what folks are adding to the chat. Okay, and it looks like most folks are getting this one easily. So our answer here is going to be E. It's a maybe, right? And let's look at our explanation. So this comes from an OCR case resolution. So from the U.S. Department of Education, one of the cases that they investigated and issued a determination on. And in this instance, we see that the LEA's policy of referring the student directly to the college for the disability-related issues may have violated Section 504. So in this instance, the LEA should have worked with the student and the student's family to communicate with the college as well to determine what the different processes may have been at the college level and to share information with the college as well. Once the college instructor notified the LEA of the student's academic struggles, the LEA could have convened the student Section 504 team to determine whether any accommodations were needed. And if the team concluded that the student was not receiving FAPE in the college courses, the LEA would have been obligated here to provide those additional accommodations. So any questions? I hope I'm explaining that one well. Nikki and Courtney, feel free to chime in as well. Okay. Okay. If no other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up this portion. April, we're right on time, 3 o'clock.
All right, look at us go. Chandrea, I do see a question in the chat about how does the LEA provide accommodations if it's a class through the local college? And I do think, keep in mind that when you're having dual enrollment situations, the dual enrollment is likely through an institution that is receiving federal funds. So they too have an obligation to identify and provide reasonable accommodations to students. So I would coordinate through your district 504 coordinator in the university how this will happen. But Chandrea, any other thoughts about how to ensure that the communication is happening?
No, and I think that's going to be the element there is just the two entities, the LEA and the university, coordinating and communicating well together to determine what the LEA has identified as accommodations for the student and determining what is available at the university level and how to provide those supports to the student there.